We have 6 items on the agenda today, 2 of which are starred, and we also have a presentation today from our animal management team. The agenda lists that presentation as being confidential, but that is an error. It is a non-confidential update on the policy approach that will be taken when a new draft local law is presented to the Governance and Finance Committee soon. I think maybe next round even. No, October. That'll be good. Righto. So, councillors, we have item 1 to deal with first up, being the confirmation of minutes. Would someone like to deal with that? That's moved by Councillor O'Neill, seconded by Councillor Gates. Councillors, I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? That is carried. Councillors, we have now our conflict of interest declarations item. I've received one from Councillor Tozer, which, if we turn our attention to the screen, is displayed. Councillor Tozer, did you want to update the... No need to stand.
Unfortunately, the streaming doesn't work unless we stand.
Oh, really? Okay, well, there you go.
My understanding is the streaming is activated for a standing councillor.
Oh, right, I thought it was the... Okay, well, that's good to know. There we go.
I don't know if that has changed, but that was the advice I received.
No. That's all right. I normally occupy my mind in the room. Okay, Councillor Tozer, go for it.
I need to declare that my wife and I own a property at 44 Moonbeam Parade, Mudgeerbar, which is adjacent to the reserve behind the Mudgeerbar Cemetery. It's referred to in the report, I think, as Koala Hill, and is a number of probably more than 100 acres. It's quite a large property. It's quite sufficiently removed from the subject area of the report. And I'd like to stay in the room and continue to debate in the public interest because of my knowledge of the local area and the community interest in that area with the consent of council.
And just to tease that out, just for clarity, those tuning in at home, so you say that the subject site is far removed from your own home. Do you imagine that you'd be impacted in any way, that you'd suffer a loss or stand to gain anything whatsoever?
No.
Great.
Not that I can see. No. No, not that I can see.
Yeah, okay, easy done. Councillors, so we have a conflict declaration there. Would someone like to move a procedural motion? Councillor Caldwell.
I probably should have thought about that before I put my hand up, but happy to move that Councillor Tozer should participate in the decision despite the conflict because his contribution as the local area councillor outweighs any perceived conflict that may arise. And if I have a seconder, I'll probably just speak to that briefly just to add a couple
Councillor Belden Lumsden will second that procedural motion. And Councillor
my understanding is that Moonbeam is quite separated from the actual cemetery location itself, as I understand. Is that right?
That's correct.
Technically, the reserve is adjacent, but there is a fair swathe of trees in between, and I don't think that there's any actual nexus that could be drawn between anything that happened on the cemetery site to the street itself.
To be clear, my property is not depicted on any of the maps used in the... It's not actually, you can't see it. It's far enough away for it not to be in the maps, but is technically adjacent a large reserve behind the cemetery that is proposed to not be used for any of the purposes discussed in this report.
Yeah, and if there are potential service changes involving different land uses, you still have access to those same services within a reasonable area.
Yeah, the services that service my property are entirely separated from them by the distance and what is a large hill.
Councillor Gates, you had a question of Councillor Tozer?
Oh, thank you. I just wondered if it's depicted on the map, if we could see where it is. On page 52.
So, Councillor...
sorry, my mistake. On page 48, it is... On page 48, I was referring to really the map on page 46. It's not on page 46, but on page 48, which is a broader map, it is the bottom left-hand corner of that map outside the boundary of the property.
Yeah.
That little dot there.
It's a very little lot.
That little
exactly,
dot there.
Very humble home, yes.
Great. Well, I mean, I'm personally satisfied with that, if we could just record that Councillor Belden Lumsden seconded Councillor Caldwell's procedural motion. Unless there are any further questions, I think we've adequately dealt with that. All right, I'll put that to a vote, councillors, and obviously we'll have to record the division there. All those in favour? All those against? That's carried unanimously by the member councillors.
Now everyone knows where I live.
All right, excellent. Okay, so that deals with item 2. Councillors, we have items 3 and 4 which are starred. Did anyone have questions pertaining to 3 and 4? I'm happy to move. Councillor Tozer second, 3 and 4. Any further questions? Forever hold your peace? No? All right, happy days. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? That is carried. Wonderful. Councillors, we have item 5 to deal with. Plainly, this has been the subject of significant media interest, and I'm sure we've all had an opportunity to talk with our communities on the back of that media interest to better understand their views, and we've all plainly had an opportunity to read the report. Perhaps I've only had people coming to me in my capacity as chair. This is just my experience. Because of a technical issue, I am proposing to move a changed recommendation, which would omit all text after attachment 5.2. Again, I'm happy to move that if I have a seconder, and then we can open it up to some questions. Councillor Caldwell.
Sorry, so just to clarify that, you want to delete everything after 5.2?
That's right.
Okay.
And the background.
So I just think, and I might be wrong about this, but I think it would be wise for us to give some leeway in case something needs to change between now and when things are signed off or whatever is going to occur. So could we put something with conditions substantively in accordance with those outlined in, or something like that? I mean, perhaps the director can give us some guidance. If she's happy for it to be strict,
yeah,
that's fine. But
yeah, and we'll clearly and plainly, it's best that we defer to the director and relevant manager. My understanding is that in the assessment of this permit, we are required to make a final decision. Yeah, Director.
So through the chair, Councillor Caldwell, the advice from talking to Cherie again this morning is that that part will need to be removed. If we can get any, and we've also spoken to the proponent, and they feel that they're capable of actually being a successful business within those conditions. So on that basis, we felt comfortable to leave them. I think if we were looking for any wiggle room, I guess we could look at that before full council. But my understanding is for the moment we need to remove that part.
It's no problems. I'm happy to second it as moved by the chair.
Councillor Gates, you had a question?
I did. Thank you, Chairman.
I don't think it's going to make much difference with you if you stand up.
The first day back and you are so disrespectful.
Deep affection. Deep affection.
Oh, I don't care. Everyone's been telling me to stand up for years.
Well, you stand up for your community and the city every day.
Oh, there you go. You've made amends. I just had a question. On page 30,
yes.
It speaks of budget and funding considerations and suggests that we're unable to impose any fee. Mm-hmm. And my question was, later in the report it talks about possibly maintenance being necessary. And so I wondered, was there any ability to provide some sort of fee for maintenance of the area? And I wondered how that impacts on the change in number 1.
Sure. Yeah, that's a terribly good question. When I had an earlier discussion with the director about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm misremembering, I think there's an issue with the rights being non-exclusive and there being difficulty in attributing impact or like restoration with a particular use or jump, as it were. Director, did you have some further thoughts on that?
No, so I could refer it to the manager, Chair, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Through you, Councillor and Chair. I understand there's no fee because there's no line item for this activity, and there's and the maintenance would be really beach sweeping and so on. That's considered.
No.
I understand that, but I feel that if we are going to approve this after our conversation today, that there shouldn't be an additional impost on the ratepayers as a result of the activity, and that whomever, if anyone,
Yes.
after our discussion, is granted the ability to undertake this activity, that any costs associated with maintenance specifically for that activity should be borne by them.
Thanks, Councillor Gates, and great question. If I could add to that, what are the arrangements at Kira presently? Because notionally we have a comparable facility available to business. Has there been I suppose, a maintenance and restoration impost on that particular landing site?
Through you, Mr Chair, no, there's no agreement for maintenance of any of the beach at the Kira site.
And have we encountered any above business as usual maintenance
Thank you, Mr
needs?
Chair, no.
Yeah. So, Councillor Gates, I suppose where I'm sitting is that a trial is going to be the best way of uncovering what the costs might be, and it could be that, like in Kira, there are no real costs. Understanding what the costs may be will then allow us to defensively arrive at a particular per jump charge, which we could only probably constitute or give rise to by amending our register of fees and charges. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yep. So we need to create a line item in our fees and charges, which needs to be defensible, but can probably only be defensible after running a trial.
Okay.
Yeah. Councillor O'Neill.
Thanks, Chair. Just two things. First thing, I'll just let over to Councillor Gates. The Kira skydiving, Gold Coast Skydive, they actually don't, there's nothing that I can actually see, and I live above there, they jump in front of me. There's nothing that I can see that with beach maintenance. I've never seen anything. They put their flags and their witches' hats out, they jump, they collect their chutes, they go back to a car that's on the street. There's no beach, there's beach sweeping, normal beach sweeping that goes on, but nothing in connection with the actual skydiving operation itself. I have a question though. On page 28, it says the use of Kira area is not exclusive to one tandem skydiving provider and would be available to this applicant should they wish to apply. Can I just clarify, did they need to put in a brand new application, or as part of this trial, would they just need to apply an operational permit for an operational permit?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, I think, for us to explore, particularly for those watching in. So does the report seek to create or trial a location, or is it for the purposes of facilitating a single operator to use
Through your chair,
the beach?
It's to trial the location. Should another applicant present themselves similarly wanting to use that location, we would consider that as well, and it would need to come back to council through this same process.
So just to take that one step further, in the absence of this particular report and council resolving its position, could this operator make an application to council or seek a permit to land at Kira already?
Yes, they can.
Yep. So there's no real nexus between the two sites. This operator can land at Kira. It is Kira, isn't it? Yep. Kira, right? What we're merely doing today is essentially to set up an assessment framework to accept applications from any operator, but in particular this one who's made an unsolicited proposal to begin operating at the site. Councillor Neal.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I appreciate that in the report it actually says that this operator will be operating from a helicopter out of SeaWorld. So, and the operator at Kira actually operates from the airport, so it makes sense that they would want another location. I've actually had did receive a call from the operator in Kira, and he has no problem with competition at all in the city. He thinks all the tourism product is a great tourism product, and he has no problem with competition in the area. So, which I thought was a really good thing to say.
I thought he would have told the other guy to go jump. And
Oh dear.
and just for everyone's benefit, I have here Councillor Ryan Belden Lumsden, Councillor Owen Jones, then Councillor Taylor. Did someone else want to add their name to the queue? No? RBL, you're up.
Are we standing? Not standing.
It's up to you.
Well, thanks, Chair. I have to stand? Okay.
No, well, it's up to you, but
Either
for
way.
streaming, apparently, it's...
Okay. Hello. Had a few concerns, but just while we're on maintenance, I'll start with Main Beach. In my perspective, is quite different to Kira. Kira is quite flat, level, very wide, whereas Main Beach is very dual. Are we likely to see faster degradation, more maintenance required because of the difference in the beachscape there?
Director, if we could get an answer to that.
Through the chair. So what we can do is we can check with our colleagues at TI around any beach maintenance concerns they have. We have checked with them once, but just on the basis of the questions today, we'll check with them before full council. If there's anything we think is additional, we can propose it before full council on maintenance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other question was just need. It's good that the other businesses don't have concerns with competition, but on page 26, where it talked about the number of users at the beach, the higher end was almost 1 million people, whereas we may only get about 24 landings per day if weather's perfect each time. It seems like there's a lot of people being potentially displaced from a busy beach to maybe service one business and 24 people. I understand it's not exclusive, which might have more landings. But
I think what's important there to note, Councillor, is that level of visitation, like they're not mutually exclusive, and there may be some overlap between visitor numbers and use of the beach as a arrival site, but accommodating a jump does not mean that 1 million people are displaced. So it'd be interesting to know what the anticipated displacement of visitors might be. Maybe that's something city officers can reflect on between now and full council, but I'd expect it'd be far fewer than 1 million. Yep.
And then I guess my last one on the need. Is in the usual process to identify a need, go out for tender. I understand this was an unsolicited application, but if we have the trial, other businesses are more than welcome to apply to use that trial site in the 12 months as well. Is that correct?
So from what I understand, and I will defer to the director in a moment, from what I understand is that the current local law permits an application to council. So what's merely happened is that an operator has exercised their right to make an application, and rather than city officers assessing that application, city officers have taken the step of putting the application through a committee and full council process to provide the maximum level of oversight in the assessment process. So today's report doesn't create any additional rights than a proponent or any other business already have, because the local law permits them to make an application.
Okay.
Director, is that a fair summation?
Yes, so through the chair, so that's right, Councillor Borster. So under local law allows someone to apply, which is what they've done today, but also it allows anyone else to apply as well, so it's not exclusive. And it's obviously, as we're saying in this, it's a trial, so this may not be a permanent option.
And the local law, if I recall it correctly, is quite interesting because it doesn't rule out commercial operators providing some level of activation on the beach. What's ruled out, and Councillor Lacastro knows passionate in this space, what's ruled out is the collection of money or like a financial transaction occurring on the beach.
At that site, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess, my main concerns were just it's a big change for an area which is at the moment purely recreational for residents, tourists. It seems like it's a need that I don't think is possibly required in that site. And as I said, all the others are subject to results from conducting a trial, and we'll be able to have more conclusive evidence from a trial. But yeah, I've got concerns at the moment.
Yeah, and thank you for your line of questioning. It's important that we ask these questions because as the director's view is, and I don't mean to speak for her, this is breaking new ground and we need to make sure that we interrogate it properly. Councillor Owen-Jones.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I was just wondering if you could, through you to the officers, if you could advise what the actual drop zone equipment is. Is it just flags?
Through your chair, it's cones that they're proposing to put out in a 25 metre by 25 metre area within the 75 metre by 25 metre drop zone.
Yep, thank you. And the number of flights per day, my understanding is that's already controlled from the SeaWorld side, and this doesn't imagine any additional flights, is that?
Through your chair, that's correct. The hours of operation are already have been agreed and approved, and they are those that are reflected in the conditions.
Thank
you. So no change.
And, yesterday I was at my office at Helensvale, and Alan Rickard, former councillor and part-time executive Save Our Broadwater, asked me about the interaction of the proposed trial with the Spit Master Plan and whether or not it was specifically to be avoided as opposed to be pursued by council, and I was wondering if you could provide any insight into that.
Director.
Through the chair, so I'm on the Spit Master Plan planning group as well, so we've been able to have a look at that. It's not impacted by that master plan, so obviously the master plan has got a lot of things going on around it, but this site's not impacted at all.
Okay, so and then finally, is any consent required by the Queensland government in regards to a trial in the bathing reserve?
Through your chair, no, there's no requirement.
Okay, Councillor Taylor, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. The actual location that we've got in the report here, evaluating that whole area. So originally when I saw the proposal, there was other locations. Do we deem that this is the best location along that stretch if we did see it fit for op purpose? Considering where they're landing at the moment is a higher usage, and there's a longer stretch along there that have got areas that aren't as many people around. So that was my concern of original site, couple of site locations. Would this be your preferred location?
Through your chair, we've assessed the application on the basis of this site that has been proposed, councillor.
Okay. Sorry.
But noting that there were a number of other sites considered further north, but they were the one that's actually been, the application's been made for is this particular site. Gareth might be able to speak to, there's been conversations.
So I'm just going to tease that question out a little bit, Councillor Taylor, on your behalf, if that's okay. So the report contemplates a specific site. The report contemplates a specific site. Councillor Taylor suggests that there were potentially other sites which may have had less impact on visitors and residents. Can you please explain how we arrived on this site? Is it merely because the applicant applied for this one and it's their right to apply for the site that they seek? Or is it that we offered up other sites that were not suitable to them for business reasons, or that were not otherwise feasible or safe?
Through your chair.
That were not otherwise feasible or safe when we referred those to, say, TNI on our foreshores team?
Yes, there were a number of, through your chair, a number of discussions for other sites held, and those weren't considered appropriate sites.
By whom?
There also were further sites north that impact on the conservation zone and have potential planning considerations and hence this is the application that we've received and assessed.
Okay, so just to be perfectly clear, because I think it's important that we be clear on this point, the alternative sites were ruled out because they may have triggered additional planning and approval requirements which didn't apply at this particular site. And that was the commercial decision by the operator to pursue this site then?
Through your chair, that's correct.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. And that's my understanding of, and my questioning is it the preferred site of a city for a landing drop, not of the actual applicant? I think I just want to touch on through the chair, Councillor Owen-Jones mentioned in relation to flights, my understanding that if someone did decide to flight, it's not going to activate any additional flights for that particular operator that's currently got a right to use of that particular area. So clarify that. And the only other question is part of the trial. I would understand that this would be part of community consultation as we go through to ensure that we come out of a trial to see whether it would work. And if it didn't work in that particular location, what would be this discussion of other locations down the track?
So, that's a great question, and I'm interested in the interaction between the consultation that Councillor Taylor seeks and the local law amendment process. Is this a minor and administrative change that can be done by the city, or does it trigger a statutory consultation process to include this main beach site within the local law?
So through your chair, this will need to go through a local law amendment process if it was to be made permanent post a trial period.
And does that trigger a statutory community consultation?
Through your chair, yes.
So, Councillor Taylor, I mean, that's a really good protection, because when a local law is amended, it requires a few things. Sometimes a state interest check, right? In fact, always, I think, a state interest check. But it also requires us to put those local law amendments out to community consultation. So if you've got constituents who at the end of the trial want to make sure that they're being heard, there's an actual prescriptive process on how they can be heard before we can make a decision about permanency. Just on the consultation piece though, say we get to the end of a trial, so we're potentially approving a trial for 12 months. It takes quite a while to then deal with amending the local law. What do you think our course of action would be between the end of the trial and the commencement of the local law amendment process? Would there be a discontinuation of the jumps, or would you imagine that we might have or might commence the local law amendment process before the trial ends, or alternatively, do we have an ability to extend the trial until that process runs its course?
Through your chair, I think all things are possible given those scenarios, depending on how the activity is being undertaken and considerations. We could bring back a paper earlier than proposed, but otherwise, or it could be extended to allow for the time period to effect a local law amendment.
Yep. So the rights of anyone who may be concerned about the outcomes of the trial will be protected by law, which I think is a good message.
Okay, so for me, I'm open in relation to having the ability to have skydiving in the particular area. My concern is that the applicant is actually dictating the spot we're landing at the moment. For me, if we're bringing in a new activity that's used for all users, that's got the ability to apply, if we do approve it, I believe we should be looking at the best location along that area for the city, the best interest of the city, not the applicant. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. We have Councillor Patterson, I think, then Councillor Hamill.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from that question about location, I do find it interesting that where we're not looking at is an area that is dictated by this conservation zone. So effectively, there's a protection of trees, dunes, whatever. So that's why we're not looking at that spot, or why the business owner is not looking at that spot. But what that does mean is that they're then looking at a spot which is far closer to humans. It's far closer to the main beach residents. So unfortunately, though, they don't have a special humans against helicopters zone. So I appreciate that the requirements in terms of SeaWorld, in terms of how many helicopters they can have in the sky, isn't altering by this, but the demand on them could very well alter. And when that was first permitted, it may not have been provided with the consideration that we may have people jumping out of the sky very close to Main Beach every half an hour from 9 to 5. That is effectively what we're saying could happen with this. I don't know whether that, it seems a little bit odd that we're looking at that rather than the conservation zone. So I appreciate there's not a question in there. There was going to be, but I didn't get it. I think it was just more making that point on that. And I suppose the broader question for me is, as a local or as a tourist coming into this city, would it make an impact on me whether I'm going to go and buy a ticket to jump out of a helicopter if I have to go to Kira versus whether I can do it at the Spit? I would tend to think that no, that's not going to make an impact on me purchasing that, and we are benefiting one business by doing this particularly.
Councillor Patterson, totally appreciate what you're saying. I think it's important though, because there will be interest in the community around this decision, that we make sure that they're left with the correct impression.
Yes.
The reality is that supporting the recommendation that's on the screen does not afford a specific operator any exclusive rights whatsoever.
I appreciate that.
So any operator, not one, as you said in your comments, any operator will have an opportunity to use this site. And it could very well be that they may jump from an aeroplane rather than a helicopter and land at this site, which would occupy the available jump slots without actually inducing any extra demand at SeaWorld, because those planes would be leaving from the Gold Coast Airport, for example. So for anyone who may be listening in, if you are labouring under the assumption that this proposal provides private property rights to a business exclusively, that's not the case. If you're labouring under the assumption that it's exclusively for skydives or jumps from helicopters, that's not the case. And if you're labouring under the assumption that this is only for departures from the central or northern end of the Gold Coast, that's also incorrect. So I just think that's really important, because we want to make sure that all operators in the city are dealt with fairly.
I appreciate that. I do also think it should be noted, though, that even though that it would all be available, there would certainly be a significant advantage to those operators that are on the Spit. One of them at the moment currently dealing with a show cause notice, so got issues with council right now, and so really the benefit there being to SeaWorld right now. But based on what you are saying, if it isn't just for SeaWorld, then we really are suggesting by this new zone that we are creating a zoning place very close to where there are a large group of residents, where we're saying that any group can come, not just SeaWorld, every half an hour between 9:30 and 5.
We're trialling, we're not creating. No. What we're proposing to do, at least what I'm proposing to do with with the support of Councillor Caldwell at this stage, is to trial the appropriateness of a potential location that could be included in a future amendment to the local law, which has the protection of a statutory consultation process and a state interest check before it becomes a permanent site for skydive jumps. So someone once said to me in a meeting, it's an opportunity to make a fully informed and complete decision. It's almost like getting a report.
I appreciate that, but the report is on, and that trial would then be for having this zone very close to where residents live, to have not only SeaWorld but anyone operate, and having more flights effectively, because you're going to have people landing there that weren't otherwise in that spot. That's the intention of the trial, and then if approved, that would continue.
No, because the local law amendment process is a statutory one, and council can resolve anything it wants, but it needs to subject its proposed amendments to community consultation. And it would be a very steep mountain to climb for council to go through a statutory consultation period and then to defy the will of the community. I'm sure we'll receive submissions from residents in Main Beach and Southport to defy that community, and then for the state government to defy them again by signing off on the amended law. So, no, if anyone's under the assumption, if you're tuning in, that council is setting in train a process that will most certainly end up with a permanent site, that's incorrect.
I appreciate that.
It's a 12-month trial to furnish operators, the market, and the community with enough information that they can make a fully informed submission into a local lawmaking process to decide the matter with permanency. So we're not at the stage of saying, yep, this is going to happen in perpetuity.
Appreciate that. So I suppose just my last question, where there is a question,
Yeah.
is if this had been triggered by us, the city, rather than a business owner, is this the site that you would be looking at?
So in the absence of an unsolicited proposal, or rather in the absence of an application which can lawfully be made under the current local law, would council have countenanced opening up an area of the beach for this activity? And
Sorry, excuse me, Chair, but I did ask a question that's slightly different to what you're asking.
Okay, no worries. Well,
So would...
Sorry, the question's through the chair. So
Okay.
Let me ask that question, and then because I've plainly got it wrong from Councillor Patterson, I'll let her ask directly through me to either the director or manager hers. But my question is, and I suppose this is a bit unfair because from a lifestyle and community directorate, we don't have carriage over economic development matters, right? But from a city officer perspective, would we have countenanced opening up a section of the beach for this use, do you expect?
So through the chair, Councillor Patterson, I think we wouldn't be looking at doing this ourselves. I think that's probably the first point. But if we were, then I think we would have looked at multiple areas and maybe recommended, this one or another one. I'm not sure we'd have to, but yeah, we'd absolutely look. We did look at a number of areas in this application. I think the other point is that the conditions that we've put on, particularly when you were talking about, any impacts to people, they're pretty strict conditions. So I think, we are very risk adverse. We've gone through a really detailed risk assessment and we've put on really strict conditions in terms of that safety component that you were talking about before.
So if that hasn't answered your question and I got it wrong, please feel free to ask it again. Or I'll come back to you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor Hamill and then Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. My question was in regards to the dune vegetation, noting that it's one of the comments on page 28 raised by the city. I'm just wondering if there's the opportunity that if the concern is that onlookers may stand up on the sand dunes to take photos or watch family members jump out of the helicopter, if there's possibly part of this that if they've got their 25-metre jump zone, if there could be a further shape out from that where they take it upon themselves to put signage up or more barriers to encourage people not to go on the dunes, and if they can communicate to jumpers' families beforehand that that's not where they're going to be, can they be part of that to make sure we don't have that issue of our dunes getting disrupted?
Yeah.
Through your chair. Yes, that's a good point, Councillor, and I am sure that the operator would be amenable to coming to some arrangement in that. It hasn't been specified in the conditions.
It has been specified.
It hasn't been specified, but that's an alternative.
So between now and full council, if there's some additional words that can strengthen what we'd like to see happen, and if you wouldn't mind circulating that to maybe all members of the committee or council, I'd appreciate it because, as you quite rightly say, those dunes are precious and should be protected. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, good catch. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. You may have already dealt with this with Kira's site, but my question is, if we did have more than one operator making use of this particular site, how do we manage that site in relation to a booking time and who gets first right of use? And I suppose the other side of the question is, if we do go ahead and there's a next 12 months trial, have we got the ability for someone else to say we'd like to trial it also for the next 12 months, or would it only apply to this particular operator?
Yep. So the trial applies to the site and non-exclusively to any operator. Lawfully, we have to consider any application made to us. So some other operator could make an application about some other site, and then we'd lawfully have to assess it. And whether or not they meet the high thresholds that we've been able to secure in our draft conditions, we won't know until we receive that application, if at all. But the booking question is super interesting, and I wonder whether we could get a response to that.
Well, through your chair, CASA regulate the airspace. So in terms of how many potential other operators could be similarly flying in that airspace to make landing, that would be managed in that way. Through council for resolution, if another applicant presents themselves and we bring it, that would require us to come back to council. And at that same time, the number of landings for this operator, for example, could be amended if there was an appetite to, cap them at its entirety and share that amongst a number of operators.
All right. So CASA, outside of any conditions that we put in, they may decide for safety's sake that they will only permit 4 jumps or 4 users using that airspace in the day, right? They could put a cap that we would not otherwise put on. Is that the case?
They could indeed.
Okay, so in terms of conflict and booking, that provides me some assurance. Can I just ask, just related to Councillor Taylor's question, my understanding was that this application need not have come to committee and council for consideration, but because of the community interest, that's what's happened. If we are to receive similar applications in the future, are you saying, and maybe this is best for the director, that all similar applications will come to council?
Yes.
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 Okay. So despite there being a delegation,
yes,
your expectation is that they will come always to us. And that's a protection, Councillor Taylor, because if we receive another application, it won't be decided under delegation. We'll get to make that call.
And I appreciate the fact that there's airspace and other regulations which we don't have control of. We have control of that particular landing site. So my question would still rely at some point, depending on what another organisation did, is if there's ability to land in one spot, how would we manage that? So it's just a question out there, because it is our spot that we do manage. The space is obviously someone else's. And I suppose the last question is, the site that's been put down in the report and the conditions we've got and the size of the actual area there, what do you believe the likelihood of how many times they could actually land during the year with a weather event? So if we're doing it as a trial, there's going to be a very good chance that there's going to be times where, under the strict conditions we've got, that they won't be able to land there. Will we get a real good trial period because the likelihood of them not being able to land because of those conditions?
Great question. I'll put it to the director ahead of this meeting. Director?
So through the chair, so we looked at a shorter trial period, like a 6-month trial period, just because we thought there'd be a lot of questions. But I think the reason why we've done 12 months is to take in those seasonal considerations. Obviously, when it's summer and when it's better weather, exactly, they'll be able to get more in. But obviously, in our storm seasons, etc., we're not going to be able to get it in. So that's why we chose 12 months in the end.
Councillor O'Neill, then Councillor Jones.
Thanks, Chair. If I can just offer some insight into that, because I live on the site.
Yes.
And it does depend on wind as well. So it might be a great day. We might be looking out, everyone's at the beach, but they can't fly. So and that happens. So I think a 12-month period is the right thing to do. I just want to also just to Councillor Patterson's comment about every half an hour. It actually says here that because of the sequence of taking off, landing, jumping, it's one skydive per hour between 9:30 and 5. So it's not every half an hour. So that cuts down even more. So I think I can just only talk about Kirra, and I know we've got a wide beach at Kirra. It's away from bathers at North Kirra Surf Club is probably the closest. But honestly, the Gold Coast Skydive run a very safe safe operation. I don't know much about this particular company, but I do know at Kira it works very well. And can I tell you, the amount of people who stop on the footpath and take photos of the skydivers, it's a great advertisement for the coast.
Nice. Councillor Owen-Jones.
Thank you, Mr Chair. On page 37 of the agenda, there's item 16 talks about the permit holder must maintain comprehensive details of any accidents, mishaps or incidents. These reports must be made available to council on request. I wonder if maybe the council should be notified in a timely fashion if there is any of those things, because I think that's that public interface. So rather than hearing about it 2 weeks later or on a current affair or wherever, we know in advance. So if that could potentially be amended. And then secondly, because it's a trial period, and in my mind that is to actually accumulate good information to make good decisions in the future. In 10, where it talks about public complaints, I think that there should be a fairly clear form that can be completed that actually articulates what the complaint is, rather than it being I saw a helicopter and somebody jumped out of it. Like, what is the issue and how we're going to manage that, and that there be a very clear contact email address or phone number for those complaints to be made and collated. So I think it's in the spirit of the trial to make sure that information is easily collected by the council, but likewise the general public can also make those complaints in a relatively easy manner.
I'm reminded of the bike share information page on our website, but we don't deal with the complaints to do with the bikes, but we do direct people to the appropriate channels and provide them a bit of an overview. A resource like that is that along the lines of what you're thinking, Councillor?
Yeah, Mr Chair, I think that it's easy to say no to something based on these are the things that we're worried about, but like if we're going to do it for 12 months, let's actually collect the information and see if there's genuine concerns that actually need to be addressed in 12 months, or after 6 months of operations, there's a clear pattern as to A, who the complaints are lodged by, or B, what the complaints are actually about.
So perhaps between now and full council, we can contemplate a further changed recommendation that deals with a bit more rigour around the monitoring and the complaints handling process, as well as further strengthening on the dune protections as well. Councillor Gates.
Thanks, Chairman. The conditions, as I've read them, and I may have missed something, but they mainly focus on the landing area. Through you, Chairman, to the officers, have the officers been provided with the proposed flight path of the helicopters? My concern obviously being that any deviation from perhaps the proposed path directly to the landing course may cause an impact on residents of the area, which we would like to avoid.
Through you, Chair, the flight path is handled by CASA, and we're advised there's no impact on flight paths as a result.
No impact on the local residential community?
That's right. There's no impact expected on local residential community.
Thank you.
In fact, the advice is that they will travel further north to get to 10,000 feet and then come back in. So if anything, noise may well be less than currently from the Joy flights.
Thank you. That was what I was looking for, to make sure that the officers were aware through CASA that there wouldn't be an impact on local amenity.
And while we don't regulate it, and I'm sure operationally they may have to deviate from that flight plan, it would be a nice gesture from the operator if they felt comfortable enough to maybe indicate what that flight path would look like and furnish us with that information. I certainly would feel as though I'm making a more fully informed decision, and I know that may talk to the heart of Councillor Patterson's concerns about residential amenity. Any further questions? All good. Well, councillors, I'm, as I said, happy to move that. Councillor Caldwell, are you happy to second that still? I'll just briefly open. Look, councillors, I walked in this room unconvinced. I have the same sort of concerns that Councillor Albertan Lumsden has, or had, or he continues to hold, which is how do we appropriately provide access to our beaches to accommodate the needs of locals and visitors, but also the tourism economy. And while we're being asked to make this decision today about this particular spot, what became clear to me, having had a chat with city officers, is that this already unfolds in our city. It already unfolds in a low impact, tasteful way in Kira, and this trial gives us an opportunity to properly understand whether that is because the Kira location has certain attributes that Main Beach does not, or whether genuinely this can be a low impact, spectacular tourism offering that can support visitation here on the Gold Coast. I think having looked at the conditions and with further interrogation from Councillor Hamill and Councillor Owen-Jones, I think we really should have every confidence that we're doing what we can to set up a good framework to support this trial and respect the fact that this applicant has the right to make an application. It's not a new right, they've always had the right. And through our assessment process, we're putting on some very heavy conditions. Councillor Gates made some excellent points about the flight plan, and I think my quiet suspicion is this. If the number of departures from SeaWorld and the Spit don't increase, but there's a demand for this tourism product, we could be taking away traffic from the residential facing side of the Spit and moving it effectively out to sea. And overall, we could end up with an improvement to residential amenity, which I think would be good for the economy, good for the locals, and good for the beach. The big test, I think, in 12 months' time will be whether there are ongoing imposts to the city and whether that might mean a discontinuation of the trial or potentially an amendment to the Register of Fees and Charges, as Councillor Gates foreshadowed, to make sure that we're fully recovering the cost of this economic opportunity. And it's no different to levying a differential rate on a tourism operator. So with that, I say let's go for it and let's take a look in 12 months. Councillors, were there any speakers against? Councillor Albertan Lumsden.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be brief. I start by saying I am comforted that it is just a trial and that we will be furnished with a suite of information to make a more informed decision in 12 months' time. But at this stage, with the information we've been given, I don't believe there's a real need for this in this location. I believe people come to the Gold Coast for our beaches, our hinterland, not to go skydiving. If they want to go skydiving, we've already got a perfectly usable site down in Kira Beach. And I just believe this activity will be more of an inconvenience than broader benefit to the city. But we'll be able to make a more informed decision in 12 months' time.
No,
thanks, Chair.
Very sensible. Councillors, any further speakers for? Councillor Caldwell and Councillor Gates.
Okay, you ready? So the first thing is that whether or not it's strictly part of this decision-making process, I did turn my mind to the Spit Master Plan because I think it's actually important that we act consistently with that. Whilst there's nothing that's specific about skydiving, I think the general commentary that's contained in that document is actually the objectives of the document are met by this type of operation. And so specifically, I'll just read you a couple of portions of that, which say things like this. A vibrant and diverse recreation and leisure activities are on offer throughout the day and into the evening. Enterprising businesses have the confidence to capitalise on the unique attributes and offerings of this remarkable setting, creating local job opportunities and prosperity. Now, to me, this is entirely consistent with that objective. And that's what we all signed up for when those of us who supported it.
That same plan said car parking underground.
Yeah, you know, that's what we were actually hoping to achieve, that we would set some parameters and that we would reasonably meet those objectives through the Spit Master Plan and the guidance that it sets. I actually don't believe that the risk of any beach or dunal damage from this particular operation is any greater than the usual wave action that occurs on any given day, let alone the people that already recreate in that particular part of the Gold Coast. So I don't see this as being some sort of phenomenal risk to the natural environment. It just is not. And I've been one of, you know, approximately 300 odd park runners on occasion who run up and down the spit using the various trails and what have you. And, you know, we actually need to welcome those activities so that people can get out there and enjoy what is a very special part of the Gold Coast. And then finally, if we are actually going to be taken seriously as a competitive and interesting tourism city, then we've got to give this kind of thing a go, or we will lose market share over and over again to more exciting, more progressive, more interesting destinations, say like Queenstown, who are prepared to do these things in order to attract business to their city. So if we don't try this, and we've got all of the protections in place for a trial for a year, we will no longer be famous for fun, we will be boring and dull. And that is not the direction that we want our city to head in terms of its tourism offerings. So on that basis, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to support your motion and hope that it earns the support of my colleagues in order to make sure that we give our city the best opportunity.
The tragedy is those remarks aren't captured in Hansard. Great contribution. Councillor Gates.
Thank you, Chairman. I think Councillor Caldwell summed it up pretty well, but I was also going to focus on the tourism opportunities, and rather than famous for fun, I was going to use the analogy that we may well become the Old Coast rather than the Gold Coast if we don't keep ahead with our tourism product, and we have to remain competitive. We are the capital of tourism in this country. We need to remain at the forefront, and I think we will be well placed to support this trial today. Know absolutely all there is to know about the outcomes after 12 months and then make our decision.
Yep, and hopefully by then we're no longer the cold coast. No, yeah, there we go. Enough said. Look, councillors, I won't close other than to say that I think Councillor Caldwell made a great contribution there, and yeah, well said. All right, councillors, I'll put that to a vote then, unless there are. No, I've closed, so I'll put that to a vote then. All those in favour? All those against? And Councillor, would you like to be noted? Are you sure? Yep, no worries. Okay, that is carried. Wonderful. It's a good debate. There we go. Councillors, we now move to a closed session item. Now, we should more or less be across this, having contemplated the original 3-point plan, the extensive report, and I know there's been some commentary and discussion on it. Councillor Gates, I know based on some of the media coverage, you've put some questions or intend to put questions to city officers. Is that something happening in the background, or would you like...
No, look, it's perfectly fine. I spoke to the director, and I'm sure I can speak openly about this. It's nothing that's within the report. Sure. It's just that there was some land adjacent to the Upper Coomera Cemetery. I didn't know whether it had protected species of vegetation on it or whatever, but there is capacity at that site, and I understand it wasn't mentioned within the report because the report focused on the issues that we considered at the last opportunity, but I was hopeful of getting some further information today about the Coomera and Upper Coomera sites.
Okay, great. So you're happy to ask those questions?
Well, if the officers are happy to answer me, that's fine. I'm sure they understand.
I suppose I'm offering you first salvo on the questions.
Well, I think I summed it up in my opening there, and if Mr Pascoe can let me know what's happening there at Upper Coomera or what the possibilities are, I would be grateful.
Thanks.
There's nothing confidential about it.
No, as you said, it's not in the report. No. So, Richard.
Sure, great. In a lot of cases, the Upper Coomera site was actually the first site we actually broke ground on the types of strategies that we've actually now progressing through. We did an expansion of the Upper Coomera site probably in around 2016, which we created an extra 360 plots at that time. The site itself, though, is low usage. We're only getting around about 4 to half a dozen burials there a year. So we do have extended capacity. The site at the rear of the Upper Coomera Cemetery is heavily vegetated. And there is also, concerns or some suggestions that there is some significance of Indigenous heritage there at that site. So it's certainly, at our preliminary point of view, capacity is not driving us to look at intervention strategy at this point in time. If we were to do that, we would need to do quite detailed ecological assessments and also heritage assessments to actually determine whether or not progressing further into that site through the removal of trees or other potential aspects of the site at a later stage. So at this stage we're parking it and we would need to go through those detailed assessments at a later stage if we did have a desire to progress through with a further expansion of that site.
Please.
Is there ever an encouragement given in order to use the capacity where it exists? I get that people possibly want their deceased loved ones close to their home, but demand and supply, are we ever able to encourage use of the site that has more capacity?
Certainly, for you, Mr Chair, that's always been part of the three-point strategy. Regenerate wherever we possibly can, expand sites within the footprints if that is available to us, and only look to the more expensive and more difficult situation of having to acquire new sites and develop those from scratch as part of that long-term need. At this stage, there's not the drivers for us to go into the detailed requirements that we believe and preempt that would have difficulties at the Upper Coomera site in achieving the types of outcomes of expanding and creating additional capacity, just because of the significant nature of the vegetated site, the nature of that vegetation, and the potential that there are existing heritage issues there. So, one that we could do some further work on, but is certainly not something that is driving us for the immediate intervention.
So,
okay,
Sorry, and I'm going to ask you a question. My sense of your question is that you weren't necessarily talking about constraints in Upper Coomera. You were wondering whether at other locations where we've got even more severe constraints, whether we were offering locals the opportunity to look at other locations. Is that correct?
Correct.
So say for instance there's a cemetery with dwindling supply, are city officers working with families to show them other options where there may be more ground?
Yeah, there's often a couple of strategies in that space. One, families often do, depending on how deep the first burial has been made, the capacity to double or triple bury, and we do obviously encourage that whenever that opportunity is available. Through the regeneration works, particularly at Southport Lawn and Southport General Cemetery, we've been able to secure additional plots close by to existing family plots, which has obviously opened up a significant opportunity for those that do want to be buried in the same cemetery, not necessarily right next to existing plots, but certainly in the same cemetery, and that's been well received with the work that we've done over the last two years at the two main Southport cemeteries. The other capacity that we do as part of the strategy that's sitting less well behind the scenes is also looking to those historical plots that have been reserved or pre-purchased that have not been taken up for an extended period of time, and there's around about 480 odd sites that meet the category of being untaken up for more than 25 years. And part of that strategy is also to look to the mechanisms that we can actually look to secure those, or if they're actually family members that we can get in contact to actually purchase those sites back. So that is a component of work that we are looking for into the next couple of years.
My recollection from having been involved in a representation years and years and years and years ago as a city officer, not as a third party, was that there's an interesting feature of the licensing process where those who may wish to return an unused plot back to the city may, what's I'm looking for, be locked into a very low price for that transaction, and therefore there's little incentive for them to effectively do right by the city. Have those issues been overcome?
For you, Mr Chair, and please note that Mr Ben Kelly, who's currently overseeing the cemeteries team, is at the back of the room, and he may jump in and add a little bit more weight to this if I don't get it fully correct. Yes, at the moment, under the mechanisms that we have available to us, if we were to have a family sell back to council, it would be at the rate that they originally purchased. And when you're talking about some of these historical purchases going back to 80 or 90 years, it's not an incentive to do so. So part of what we are looking through, including considerations of the review of the local law, is capacity for the city to look at a buyback process, which would be at a high percentage of the existing rate, or for us to purchase it back at the existing rate as per the fees and charges.
Yeah, interesting. Councillor Gates, please.
And I think I can also ask this in open because it's been the subject of consultation and discussion publicly previously, and that's when Exit 54 was expanded and the state swapped us some additional land at Pimpamar for the land that they took for the Exit 54 upgrade. Have we explored the possibility or the type of vegetation, it's a heavily vegetated land at Pimpamar, how that would place us in terms of developing that site with regard to the vegetation on that site?
Chair, I might actually refer that to Kim Breeze, who's the project officer who's overseeing the ecological assessments of that site.
Thank you.
Through the chair. Yeah, we've investigated that site quite thoroughly, and we had an ecological assessment study done on the whole site. So that identified particular areas with high ecological value just with regards to the existing vegetation. So the highest value areas are actually at the northern end of that site, just adjacent to the existing Pimpamar Cemetery. The best areas for a cemetery expansion are at the southern end, but the biggest constraint that's existing at that southern end is a piece of land that transects the entire site, which is owned by Department of Main Roads. And so if we were able to get that piece of land, then we could have further looks at whether or not a cemetery could be developed. But at the moment, it appears to be not feasible as long as that's there.
Yeah, further to that for you, Mr Chair, the site, as we know, was the former Pimpamar Springs Golf Club. So there are still elements of the former golf course that are semi-cleared. And part of what council has supported us in the past is some funding on our component of that site to continue to maintain some level of maintenance and intervention to ensure that we have the capacity to provide burial opportunities to those cleared sites into the future. But outside of the past footprint of the golf course, you know, there is significant vegetation on that site.
Councillor Tozer.
Thank you. My question through you to the officers is just in relation to the adoption of the 4-year capital works budget that's in the public domain. It talks about on page 59 the allocations. Having read the report and gone through it with some detail, it occurs to me only item 7 in the proposed recommendation, the elements of 7, are the only thing that is not funded. Is that correct? So items 1 to 6 in the recommendation, it seems like all that is captured in section 7 of the report on page 59, and it's only section 7, the particulars of section 7 are the only thing that seems to be unfunded into the future. Everything that is talked about in this report is effectively fully funded. Is that correct?
That's correct. For you, Mr Chair, are you referring to recommendation 7?
So recommendation
Yes.
7, it looks like the investigations, the idea of investigating is funded, but the actual
Yes, the acquisition costs
potential outcome is
associated
not, but
with both a possible northern site and a possible southern site are at this stage not identified
Yeah.
and within the current 10-year plan. The work that needs to be done is to identify and secure a potential site. The actual need is much longer term.
Yep.
When we've actually gone through the process of determining a possible likely site, we will come back to council as we do with other land acquisitions, and then that will start to provide a budget footprint supporting or otherwise, the direction of council.
Yeah, so the purpose of my question is to be sure that in the adopted capital works budget that just occurred on the 23rd of June, all of the elements of this report have been fully funded. Great, thank you.
Councillor Hamill, then Councillor Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for you to Richard. There's a block of land on Rotary Park Road in Stapleton that I have seen marked on old maps as Stapleton Cemetery. So is that land still earmarked for that, or is that being moved across for a different purpose?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor Hamill, the best person to refer that question is probably to Ben, who has a greater understanding of the historical acquisite sites. No? Happy to take that on notice and to investigate that and bring that back through to yourself.
I think, Mr. Chair, it could go back quite a lot of decades, but when that was purchased by the previous council in that area, but it is marked on maps as Stapleton Cemetery, so just interest because it's a big holding of land. It's completely vegetated still. Second question was in regards to Albertan Cemetery, noting that it sits on the boundary of a big chunk of land that's currently marked in LGIP as possible district sports fields and open green space in the future. Could it be considered through that LGIP that part of that could be used to expand Albertan Cemetery in the future?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the LGIP itself does not provide a mechanism funding-wise or to support cemetery use. Not to say that if the overall parcel of land as identified for requirement that we could not be part of that conversation, but any costs associated with that or any value attributed to that would need to be funded through other sources outside of LGIP.
I think you should get that one on the mic, Mr. Chair, that comment.
I had many others. They're all too dangerous to utter.
That's fine. And Mr. Chair, just a third and final question, because it was one raised with me by some locals in the area, was could you just confirm that Pimpama Island Cemetery is not a city-run cemetery and that it doesn't form part of the overall cemetery regeneration plan?
For you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. It is not a council-controlled or facilitated cemetery.
Just in a supplementary, Mr. Chair, if I could, if there was an interest from the current trustees of that cemetery in maybe not running it in the future, would the cemetery, city be interested in looking at that opportunity?
I think that's a good one on notice.
Take that on notice and investigate that further.
Yeah. Councillor Gates.
Thanks, Chairman. Just one more comment, or half a question, half a comment. Item 7 that Councillor Tozer referred to, are the officers aware of land, or are they seeking for us if we are aware of a parcel of land that may be suitable to make that suggestion to you? There's one parcel of land that I'm aware of, and I know Councillor Owen-Jones is too, that's in private ownership, but it was purchased, I think, before the last city plan was introduced, and the land in question is in the interurban break, which renders it difficult for development. And the owner of the land has in the past visited me with some suggestions about its development, and quite clearly whatever he had proposed is not possible any longer. And I think the land was most recently used as a storage area for some light rail works or something of that nature. So, you know, land like that may be a possibility, that the use has changed, and perhaps we should just forward any information through to you for possible contact to see if there's any interest in selling.
Great. Yes, through the Chair, we have no preconceived position in relation to sites in the north, and as always, the importance of the local knowledge of the divisional councillors is always favourable in relation to considerations as we move forward. Happy to receive that information.
Okay, thanks.
So that's just in regards to the potential of the city acquiring a site to expand, I'm going to say, the business unit, but that's also, there's nothing that necessarily prevents a private owner, as we've seen throughout the city, or also being in the business of graves. Yeah, so it may very well be just that conversation is enough to trigger somebody wanting to be in the business that the council doesn't necessarily have to be in.
I'm not talking specifically about this one, but it's always fascinated me the planning considerations around a cemetery, because really you wouldn't want to change of use application after 25 years. And completely offline, I suppose, I wouldn't mind a call from a city officer just around that particular public policy issue. Just generally, you know, if there was a way of supporting private cemeteries, what guarantees under law can we provide to the community that this really will be a final resting place and not a temporary holiday? I know, it's like I was saying to someone before, like in my grandparents' village in Sicily, after 100 years you're dug up and your bones are put in a jar. You know, that's how they manage their constraints with land. You know, it's yeah, it's full on. All right. There you go. Councillors, with any questions that you'd like to put in close that might have dealt with confidential matters? No. Would someone like to move the item? Councillor Tozer, seconded Councillor Gates. Councillors, any speakers against? No. Councillor Tozer, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Councillor Forster. This matter is, whilst there's been a few puns here and there, and even just now talking about Sicily, you know, it can be, sometimes we deal with difficult matters by making light of them a little bit, and frankly, this is actually a really important activity of council, a core business of council that enables people to have some certainty about remembering their loved ones when they've passed, and frankly, a number of these locations are really important historical locations that remind us of people who built this city many generations before we started serving the city. So I know the Albertan Cemetery has been around for almost 100 years now, and you know, it's a place of reverence, but it's also a place where family members of, you know, all sorts of members of our community are remembered. And I hope, you know, I hope the councillors support this idea of a strategically planning for us to move forward, which is exactly what this report proposes to do, making plans for the future so that the next 2 or 3 decades adequately accommodate the needs of our community as we remember loved ones and also remember the wonderful and rich history of our city.
Councillor Gates, would you like to add anything? Okay. Councillors, speakers against? No. Councillor Tozer, did you wish to close? There you go. Lots. I'm resisting the urge. Councillors, I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? And that was carried unanimously. I'm assuming then that captures the fact that Councillor Tozer voted in the affirmative. Right. Yeah? Sorry? Do we need to note it? Oh, okay. Yeah. If we could note then that Councillor Tozer voted in the affirmative. Great. Awesome. All right. Well, councillors, the only other item we have on the agenda today is a presentation. Again, just to bring you up to speed, Council has resolved to review its animal management laws, predominantly to respond to changes in state legislation, but also to harmonise our approach with that of other adjacent local governments. It's been some time since our rules have been reviewed, and other local governments have moved in the space of, say, koala protection, whereas we haven't yet. So the purpose of this presentation is for us as a committee who have had carriage over this process up until this point, is to understand where city officers have landed in their preferred approach to change. And as we flagged earlier on in the meeting, this will ultimately be decided by the Governance, Administration and Finance Committee, who have carriage over local law amendment. We'll run through the presentation. Yeah, go for it, Councillor Patterson. We'll run through the presentation, and then before taking questions, I'll just flag a couple of outstanding questions that I have, having met with city officers. Councillor Caldwell, yeah, go for your coffee. Right, here we go.
Good afternoon. As has been introduced by our chair, the purposes of this presentation today is to outline the amendments being proposed in an upcoming report to council. I'll be going through through the background to each of the key amendments and give an overview of the changes and the impacts that are expected from each. I also have Michael Smith, Coordinator of Animal Management, here today, and Donald McKenzie, Executive Coordinator of Environment in PNT, who are here to help answer any questions following the presentation.
Don't worry, we don't bite. Yeah. That's all right.
Sorry, I meant to check this with you before I came.
Just while we're waiting, councillors, I'm not sure whether Kylie Sogard got introduced. Kylie's our Senior Policy Officer in Health and Regulatory Services. So,
No? I've broken it already. Okay, so there have been 3 specific reports and decisions made in relation to the proposed amendments over the past few years. I'll have to get you to click again, sorry. In 2019, there was some public interest and attention around some specific cases of animal attacks and also around an animal noise matter. And as a result of this, a report was brought to council in November 2019, recommending that the law be amended to address those specific issues that were highlighted. The report was adopted at that time, and since then, we've undertaken the process of reviewing and consulting with internal stakeholders, also engaging the solicitors to draft the laws has been undertaken at this point. So in addition to the 2019 report, there have also been 2 separate reports that have been brought to council surrounding koala protection, one in 2016 and a further report in 2020, which each gave full details of the koala protection amendments proposed as part of this amendment process. Council resolved in both cases to move forward with these changes to support the koala populations in the city. There are many amendments being proposed as part of this report. However, a significant number are just administrative in nature, including, for example, we've aligned our local laws with changes to the state laws that have been made in recent years. I won't be going through all of these changes in this presentation, but I will be outlining the key or material changes that we're proposing in the laws. Wonderful, thank you. So the key changes proposed are in 6 key areas. The first one being animal noise nuisance, the second being permit types that we issue and the prohibitions on keeping certain types of animals, animal enclosures, control of animals in public places, the enforcement tools that are available to our officers, and of course the koala protection provisions. We are proposing changes to noise nuisance laws and criteria. The current criteria for determining whether an animal noise nuisance or determining what an animal noise nuisance is has been problematic for a range of reasons. These matters again were considered in detail in the 2019 report, and a new set of criteria was proposed as part of this report, and it was supported at this time. I'm going to apologise here for this busy slide. I have included here in this slide the full text of the current law and the proposed law. But to summarise, under the current law, the focus is on there having been a certain number of complaints being received. There is no criteria currently relating to how often the noise occurs or for what length of time. In the proposed law, the criteria focuses on the noise exceeding a specified duration of time, dependent on whether it is daytime or nighttime. The times defined reflect noise nuisance criteria in the Environmental Protection Act, which is designed to apply a more stringent criteria to prevent sleep disturbance.
Let's let the presentation run its course, and then we'll come back to these 8. I'll make a note that you wanted to ask a question on noise nuisance. Yep.
In addition to this time and duration criteria, the noise must also be assessed as having a material impact on the receiving environment or on the affected residents. For example, the noise could be something that's causing interference to a neighbour, but if it only happens a couple of times a day for a very short period, it would not be a noise nuisance under the proposed criteria. A dog that barks very loudly when someone comes to the front door of a residence would be an example of this. In a situation where a noise occurs for a significant duration but is not of a volume or nature that's considered to be interfering, it would also not be a noise nuisance. Again, an example might be a pet budgie that sings throughout the day, the noise being audible but not loud or interfering. If these changes are adopted, residents affected by animal noise will still be required to keep a noise diary before officers will come out to make an assessment. The entries in the noise diary will be used to determine whether it is likely that the noise is exceeding the duration and frequency criteria in the law. If that's the case, if the diary indicates that it's being exceeded, then on-site assessments will be undertaken, and during the assessments the officer will measure the duration, the frequency of the noise, and they will also make an assessment of the level and characteristics of the noise to determine if it's interfering. So as you can see, the proposed criteria has a focus on a measurable criteria and is not dependent on there having been a certain number of complaints being received in the area. In reviewing animal noise laws in our region, it was noted that Brisbane, Redlands and Logan all are currently using the duration criteria that we're proposing. The difference being that they do not have to satisfy both duration and interference. We do believe, however, that the criteria we're proposing is clearer and more robust than the others surveyed. The next significant changes being proposed are related to our permit system and prohibitions. It's important to note that regardless of whether or not a permit is held or required to be held, that all animal owners must keep their animals in accordance with the minimum standards set out in the local laws. It was recommended in the report adopted in 2019 that we review the permits with the aim of removing requirements for permits where they're not providing any benefit in achieving compliance. So under the proposed laws, permits will no longer be required for animal carers, bees, geese, ducks and turkeys, or rats and mice. We are also proposing to remove permit requirements for animal breeders, kennels, pet shops and guard dogs, all of which are either subject to the requirements of other state laws or are operating under planning approval conditions. There is no change proposed to the permit requirements for keeping of aviary birds other than that pigeons have been grouped with budgerigars and canaries. This has resulted in a minor increase in the number of pigeons from 2 to 4 that can be kept without a permit on small blocks and multi-residential premises before a permit's required. In relation to prohibitions, it is proposed that an exemption be provided for keeping horses on land under 2,000 square metres in the Bundall Equestrian Precinct. This change corrects an oversight in the current laws which failed to acknowledge this being an intended land use in this area. The change will make lawful the current land use in this precinct and will enable permits to be issued. By issuing permits, it will mean that the intensive land use can be monitored more proactively for potential environmental and public health impacts. Other prohibitions being removed include keeping more than 30 geese, ducks and turkeys on land greater than 1 acre. When reviewing other local government areas, we noted that the animal management laws that have been reviewed more recently are generally adopting a red tape reduction approach. Brisbane recently reviewed their laws and applied a similar approach to what we're proposing. They removed the requirements for permits for pet shops, guard dogs, breeding, and some other permit types as well. Oh, I've gone too far. In relation to hens, under the current laws, there is an absolute prohibition on keeping any hens on allotments smaller than 600 square metres. While it is likely that most allotments of this size are not suitable for keeping hens, it is proposed to remove this prohibition and instead apply a minimum area of land that must be provided for each hen that's being kept. As an example, if someone has a 500 square metre block of land, but the house and front yard covers 400 square metres of it, then there is less than 150 square metres of land available, and therefore a hen would not be able to be kept on that allotment. In addition to this, it should be noted that the minimum standards outline a number of further requirements designed to prevent any nuisance occurring as a result of keeping of hens. One of these requirements is that the enclosure is not within 10 metres of a residence on an adjoining allotment or within 1 metre of any side or rear boundary of the allotment. So while it is being proposed that this absolute prohibition be removed for lot sizes smaller than 600 square metres, there are not likely to be many circumstances where all of the requirements could be met. In proposing this change, it was considered that if they could be met, that there should be no reason for us to prohibit it. The next set of changes relate to enclosures. There are three main changes proposed in relation to animal enclosures. The first is in relation to preventing animals from being able to attack or cause fear from within their enclosure. The second change relates to electronic containment of pets. Electronic containment is a system where a wire runs through or just above the ground around the perimeter of the enclosure, and the animal wears a collar, which then, when it's in proximity to the perimeter of the enclosure, emits a warning tone and then a static correction or a small shock to discourage the animal from crossing the perimeter. These systems have become popular, probably due to their lower relative costs when compared to installing a physical fence. The other change is requirements for horse enclosures. So the first change is proposed due to a number of incidents that have occurred where dogs have attacked or caused worry by reaching over or through gaps in fences. While the animal is still contained, it has not been prevented from causing harm or worrying passers-by. Incidents over recent years include dogs attacking other dogs in neighbouring allotments, and dogs biting or worrying posties as they're trying to deliver mail into the mailbox. The proposed change to the law would enable officers in cases where an issue's been identified to get owners to modify their fence. This might involve lining gaps in the fence with wire mesh or another material, or potentially raising the height of a fence as well. Relation to electronic containment. In a recent court case, it was ruled that electronic containment does meet the requirements for a proper enclosure under our current laws. Concerns have been raised due to the fact that these systems do not always work for certain breeds of dog. They do not work when there are power failures, and also that visitors or other animals may enter the dog enclosure unknowingly. Under the proposed change, anyone using electronic containment currently and solely would need to install compliant fencing. This transition would be managed operationally and providing that the dog is being contained, effectively a grace period would be given to allow for fencing to be installed. The third change in relation to enclosures is in relation to horses. Currently, there are specific enclosure requirements for horse owners such that all horses are to be prevented from reaching over or through fences. Standard post and rail fencing is 1200 millimetres high and therefore does not meet this requirement. It is considered that this requirement is unnecessary and therefore it's being proposed to be removed. Many horse owners would currently be in breach of this requirement despite no real risk to passers-by. This change would align us with the majority of the local governments in this region. It's noted that stallions do pose some risk and therefore it is being proposed that the existing requirement for a secondary fence for stallions be retained in the law. In relation to animals in control of animals in public places, a couple of minor changes are being proposed. These changes relate to how we define what effective control of the animal is. Although a more minor matter, it's proposed that the current requirement for dog leads to be no longer than 2 metres be removed. Longer leads, including retractable leashes, are commonly used and are considered effective in providing, as with any lead length, they are effective providing that the person in control of the animal is physically able to control it. With respect to off-leash dog parks, dogs must, under the current laws, be in the immediate vicinity of the person in control of the animal. This is further defined in the law as being within 10 metres. This restrictive requirement is not considered to be in line with community expectations. It's proposed to remove this and instead require only that the person can see the dog. The other requirements already in place will remain, being that the person can control it with voice commands and that the dog is not attacking or threatening other dogs or animals. When reviewing the current law against other local governments in the region and against the model local law, it was noted that our fines are significantly lower, half that in fact of all others for key offences. The fine amounts currently applied on the Gold Coast are not considered to be an effective deterrent or reflect the high-risk nature of some of these offences. It's proposed that the fine amounts for the offences listed be increased from 1 penalty unit, which is currently $137, or to 2 penalty units, currently $275. Those figures may have been amended since since that was sent out with the increase to the penalty units that took place on the 1st of July. Also, in relation to enforcement tools, while fines can be used to regulate certain activities, in some circumstances, other enforcement tools are considered to be more effective. Currently, the only enforcement tool available to officers for addressing owners who fail to register or microchip their animals is a fine. Issuing a fine to someone who has possibly failed to register their animal due to the associated cost is in many cases ineffective. After having issued one fine and the owner still has not registered their animal, the only option is to issue further fines. We are proposing as part of the amendments to Local Law 12 to introduce the ability to issue a compliance notice to an owner who fails to register or microchip their animal. If the owner still failed to register or microchip the animal after having been issued a compliance notice, then the officer has the option to take the matter before the court, and ultimately this may result in seizure of the animal. In circumstances where issuing a fine has not resulted in compliance, the option to escalate the enforcement with potential for a far more significant penalty is considered much more likely to achieve the outcome that's required. In relation to koala protection, these amendments, as mentioned earlier, were detailed in full in the adopted report that went to Council in 2020. Currently, our local laws do not have any requirements in them that protect koalas from dogs. Under the proposed laws, there are obligations for all dog owners to protect a koala entering the property from being attacked by a dog if they become aware of it being there. Within a koala area, which is a significant proportion of our city, there are additional requirements for dog owners to comply with. If someone resides at the premises, they have two options of how they can comply. The two options are to have a fence that's designed to prevent koalas being able to get into the dog enclosure, or alternatively they must provide a means of escape for the koala. If no one resides at the premises, then they must comply with the first option. There are additional requirements for dog owners in koala areas on larger allotments. In their case, during the night, the dog must be confined to a koala-proof area. For example, inside the house or in a dog run, or must be tethered. These requirements are aimed at preventing a koala coming under attack on a part of the property where the owner cannot hear or see that the attack is occurring. This slide shows some examples of how compliance can be achieved with the new requirements. The first photo shows a fence designed to prevent a koala getting into the enclosure. The second and third slide shows some examples of how owners can provide a means of escape for koalas who do enter the enclosure. The anticipated impacts to dog owners were detailed in the 2020 report, and it was noted that although there are large numbers of affected properties, that the majority of dog owners will not need to make any changes to their property in order to comply with the proposed requirements, with some properties potentially requiring minimal actions. Education is proposed to be undertaken to assist dog owners in understanding the new requirements and what their options are in order to meet these obligations. From here, the next steps are to bring the proposed amendments to the Governments and Administration Committee and Council, and then to undertake the state government and public consultation periods. When the report goes to the Governments and Administration Committee, the amending laws, along with consolidated marked up copies of the laws, will be attached to the report in full. If there are no significant matters raised during the consultation, then the report to make the local law should be able to be tabled in February, with gazettal occurring in around March next year. That concludes the outline of the changes, but Michael, Donald and myself are here to field any questions that anyone might have.
Right. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm also cognizant of the time, so I'm sure we'll knock out these questions quickly. I'm just going to repeat a few of the questions that I put to officers during our earlier discussions for the benefit of the committee. Then we'll go to Councillor Tozer and Councillor Gates. Thought maybe it's a good opportunity to flesh out some issues. And then Councillor Young. So I want to turn first to the issue of hens. Right. So presently there's a prohibition on the keeping of hens on any lot with an area less than 600 square metres. I think quite sensibly, city officers want to take a look at the usable hen area, as it were, this 150 square metre test. I suppose my concern is this, just because a lot might have 150 square metres of free area doesn't mean that that area is suitable for the keeping of a hen. So for example, you might have a house with a timber deck around a pool taking up much of the 150 square metres. That's not necessarily the best place for a hen. The actual vegetated area that might be available for the hen to enjoy some quality of life might be quite less than the 150 square metres. So my question again is, that 150 square metres, does it deal with the total area outside of the building footprint, i.e. the home, or does it test how much appropriate area is available for a particular hen?
The wording in the proposed law is the land available to the animal, so it would be their enclosure, or if it was, if the hens were without enclosure, it would be that total area within that yard of that property. Having said that, the minimum standards require certain things in terms of separation from neighbouring residences, from the property boundary, etc.
Yeah. So in my experience, as limited as it is, and I grew up with chickens around the house. I think my grandmother resuscitated one that fell in the pool. We were a chicken-loving family, but It's another story. It's a great story. She gave it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation after the chicken had fallen in the pool, and she brought it back to life. It's a treasured part of our family law. But yeah, I suppose my concern with chickens on sort of existing and living on a impermeable surface is that their droppings can then easily be washed away with rainwater, for example, onto lower and adjoining properties, which is why I've got an interest in supporting the keeping of chickens, but ensuring that that's done on in an appropriate environment where any amenity would be contained within that lot and not washed into a neighbouring property. I'm not sure if any of you have ever had issues with people complaining about even dog faeces coming from their neighbours' property and washing into theirs. So do you think there's an approach that we can take if we are to relax the keeping of hens that really talk to the available and appropriate space rather than just all space?
Through your chair, under the proposed amendments, we're removing the permit, so there would be an entitlement to, in accordance with the requirements, the pens, as long as they met the boundary requirements. But on complaint, we would inspect. If there were issues, we would take action, of course, to.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm just re-asking that question because I think that's still, for me, an unresolved amenity issue. So I just want to ask that question. So again, so that you guys were across that. On the issue with the effective control of an animal on leash and off leash, I'm just interested why we did not. Okay, if we could just go back to that slide, if that's all right, if we've got the ability. Yeah. So yeah. So when a dog is off lead, absolutely that dog should have to respond to voice commands and must not threaten, attack other animals or people. But why wouldn't we also include that test in the on-leash scenario, given that that lead or that leash can be of effectively unlimited length?
Yes, through the Chair. Councillor, that is automatically included as part of the definition of effective control. In the on-lead component, it also includes the requirement to ensure your animal, even while on lead, is effectively controlled by not being able to threaten or attack a person.
Right, and yeah, and I'm not trying to be facetious or anything, but can you see maybe from my perspective, looking at that slide, it suggests that that voice command and attack doesn't form part of the test in the proposed law for on leash?
Yes, we'll reference that and correct that.
Awesome. And on the on the issue of the pigeons, so I suppose the aggregation of species, I totally get, because it can become administratively burdensome to deal with all manner of permits for birds and all the rest. But coming from a family that kept pigeons and doves, bet you guys didn't know this. Yeah. Yeah, we used to squabble. Anyway, the noise from a pigeon is quite constant. Like a budgie will be intermittent, but yeah. So I suppose my first question is, are officers reasonably satisfied that a pigeon which produces continual background noise can reasonably be kept in numbers of 4, up to 4 without a permit?
Yes, Councillor, we're reasonably satisfied that that is the case. We also have the conditions and the minimum standards for the keeping of those animals still in place. So we can, if a complaint was to arise, we can investigate and deal with the matter of the noise where it's occurring rather than not.
Now, the noise test for a bird, right, is interesting to me. Do we default back to the tests provided for by the EPA, or are there particular nuisance and noise tests for birds? Because plainly, we can't apply the dog barking test when establishing noise nuisance, when we're talking about a bird nuisance.
The EPA does not provide an avenue for investigating animal noise, domestic animal noise.
Sure.
It actually defers it to a local law requirement. The animal noise requirement of our local law does allow us to investigate it. It's not specifically to barking. It would be any noise created from an animal. So we would just have to look at the period of time it occurs as well as the impact on the amenity.
Right, and my last question just restated. I heard during the presentation that there may be a permit or a treatment or an approach taken for those who are caring for animals. Now, I'm not talking about anyone specifically, but you do, at least in my community, see groups from time to time that are animal refuges, where somebody might be providing care for multiple animals because it's a good and charitable thing to be doing, but they have been in contravention of the current local law. So in the proposed changes, is there a proposal to relax any requirements on those who are providing care to animals, rescuing them, lack of a better word?
Councillor, I believe there was a requirement for a carer permit, in particular for animals on those regards. I must say I would have to take that on notice to check that now. Yeah. But there was a carer permit for that purpose and for foster caring.
Yeah, and look, I just think it's interesting. In my experience, again, I'm not speaking about any specific case, I've had complaint where somebody has had a carer permit, right? And I find that that creates interesting tension in the community around here are the rules, but then someone's able to argue that they are carrying out some charitable cause, and sometimes, people may question the due process that we apply. So I just think as we're tweaking these limits, we have to have some regard to things like carer permits that may override these caps, if at all, and maybe even reconsider whether we should be overriding them to begin with. Last thing, and I'd be interested from an officer point of view on this. Just the other day, and it's just absolutely gut-wrenching to hear this, there was a report 2 days ago on the ABC, and the headline is, 5-week-old boy mauled to death by dog on the New South Wales Central Coast. Time and time again, we're confronted by these harrowing stories, and it's not just in a backyard in a residential setting. These attacks also happen in our parks and our playgrounds. I've said this publicly and I've said it at committee. My firm view is that we need really strong deterrence for people who are not keeping their animals under effective control. I've publicly said, in my personal view, they need to be the harshest deterrence. We're talking about children's lives, and I know that sounds like a trite thing, but experience tells me it's a very real risk to manage. People are not getting the message. My view is that we should have the most significant financial deterrent for people who are not keeping their dogs under effective control. Officers have proposed 2 penalty units merely to bring us into alignment with every local government. Can I just get a sense from city officers whether they believe that there is any additional deterrent value in having that financial penalty set at 2.1 or 2.5 penalty units? Or do you believe that there is no marginal benefit in exceeding the 2? Yes. Yes, please, Councillor Gates.
My husband was last year attacked by 2 dogs that the gate was inadvertently left open. And in looking at the presentation, I have written attack penalty. And I don't understand why we can't have an attack penalty, because We knew where the dogs came from. The officers thoroughly investigated it and nothing happened.
Yep.
Absolutely nothing happened, but my husband was hospitalised and seriously impacted by it. It took weeks for the infection to go and he was seriously ill. That is unacceptable. It's more unacceptable that a child be attacked, but there was nothing that the officers in the end could do, despite knowing who owned the dogs. It just went by the by.
Yeah.
Sorry, can't help.
No, look.
Not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely, Councillor Gates. And you may recall that we moved to general business item many moons ago now, and what we uncovered was that the state government, through the Animal Management Cats and Dogs Act 1994, is it 92?
2008.
Oh, they've updated it. Yeah, sorry. 2008, they legislatively prevent council from introducing a penalty for an attack. Instead, their preferred approach is merely to have us designate a dog as menacing, dangerous, or to destroy it, which I think is absurd. I think is absolutely absurd. Now, the reply from the government is that they have got no appetite to reform the law. But my view is that the 2 penalty units should read a 3, a 4, or a 5. Where it's within our power, it needs to send a clear message. Now, I'm not saying it should apply to every offence, but when there is a
serious offence,
a real risk of catastrophic injury, we should be doing something about it. And I know this will be dealt with at GAF, but the meeting's continuing, and perhaps someone would like to move a general business item that when this matter is considered by GAF, that the proposed penalty unit for the failure to keep animal under effective control should be at a minimum of 3 penalty units. I would welcome that general business item from the floor if somebody wants to put pen to paper.
Happy to.
Councillor Tozer.
So my questions actually relate to the noise section of your presentation, and I'm interested in lots of places in Division 9 and probably across the city, there are permissible land uses adjacent one another where the rural residential zone almost boundaries the rural zone. And so my questions relate to the commentary that you spoke, Kylie, about the noise on property or impacting, you've used the word receiving residents. And so you used, I think, the word like interfering with the amenity of the given area. So in lots of areas across Division 9 in particular, there's a rural residential zone, which is technically a residential area, and it's right next to a rural zone. Help me understand how you would interpret the new laws when you receive a complaint from the residential area about a lawful activity happening in the rural area.
Good question.
Through the chair. Every situation would need to be assessed independently, particularly taking in the rural residential area. The officers go out and, as part of that diary information, they will then be looking at the behaviours and the animals that are occurring. So if we are taking cattle or some form in those areas, they would then be going back to speaking to the owners of the cattle and looking at that and looking at what the issues are around that, or how the noise is occurring. If it is a permissible activity, it may then fall outside the local law requirements if it is a permissible activity under the town planning scheme. So we would have to look into that initially. If it doesn't fall into that area, then we would be assessing the situation from where the person is believed to be being impacted. So if their property, if their house is 100 metres away from it, and because it's a very open area, how much that animal is actually impacted, the noise is impacting on the person and what they're undertaking, and then working with the owner on potential avenues to reduce that, not immediately just determining it to be a breach just because it did it for over 6 minutes or 3 minutes accordingly. Working on a solution there.
So I think what I'm trying to propose or trying to ask for some advice around is lawful or self-assessable land uses in the rural zone should not be subject to any council resources investigating noise complaints from a neighbouring residential zone. The rural zone is the rural zone. and you should be able to conduct lawful rural activities in that zone. It occurs to me in my division anyway that there are a not insignificant amount of resources from time to time from the animal management team investigating the noises of farm animals in the rural zone. And I think that's a poor use of our resources. So I think that when lawful or self-assessable activity is occurring on a block of land or on a property, you know, the animal management team should receive the complaint, note the complaint, and also inform the complainant of the entitlement of a property owner to conduct lawful or self-assessable activities on their property. I don't think we should be disregarding it entirely, but I was even contacted today about a resident in Gilston who is on a property that for many, many years was zoned rural, the site itself has never been changed from rural, and someone is complaining about a rooster. Now, I appreciate roosters are frustrating, but you bought a property, even though this is a residential zone, you bought a property next to an area that is clearly rural, and I feel like we are undertaking a not insignificant amount of resource allocation to dealing with a complaint that is maybe unreasonable. So my question then is, what do the changes to the law that we're proposing reduce our allocation of resources to complaints like that?
Through the chair, no, they won't. No, that it will actually allow us to be more regulated on those issues more than what they currently are. Because we could just get 3 neighbours presently just don't like it, and automatically it's a breach, irrespective.
So I would like some advice about changes to the local law that that enable property owners on land, you know, lawful activities or self-assessable activities on a given piece of land to have some protections, but also to return the onus on a complainant to have regard for the zoning in the area where they've purchased a home. I don't know how to deal with this appropriately, but what I'm trying to do is I'm reduced. Like, there was a lot of stuff in the media about this cow mooing in Bonogan, and that's just dumb.
So I'm going to ask a question, not to reframe it, but to ask my own very similar question. My sense is that the new approach should align more closely with Councillor Tozer's desired outcomes.
Yes.
Because the current approach, being very prescriptive, would give automatic rise to a nuisance issue, whereas the proposed law allows city officers to exercise more discretion to establish what is a reasonable use and reasonable enjoyment of land. Of course, it's got to be a defensible decision, but city officers are more empowered, or would be more empowered, to exercise some judgment that pays regard to the underlying land use. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Okay, so I don't know how to move forward from here, but what I would like to do is get some more advice about that before we consider the local law, because I think...
Which is in October, I think.
That's all right. To me, there's plenty of time. My question is, can you provide me some advice about how we can adjust the local law to reflect that view? I think the majority of people in Division 9, which is a primarily rural and rural residential area by geography, understand that they chose to live in an area, and even though they might have thought peace and quiet, they actually... you know, they should expect to hear farm animals in farming areas. Part 2 of that is where a land use has been, where a property has been subject to a land use application that is inconsistent with the city plan. And the example I'm going to give you is wedding venues in the rural zone. So wedding venues and function centres are a permissible... Not permissible. So they're in our city plan. They require a material change of use application and impact assessable application. I would like to make sure that they don't slip through the cracks when it comes to noise complaint. I appreciate this is about mostly animals, but I would hate to think that a law that we introduce here had a kind of corresponding impact when someone made a different type of noise in the rural zone. So I don't want anything to do with this law to impact other sorts of noise for impact assessable applications, that even if they are approved.
And could we just add to that advice that you might solicit?
Could we get an understanding of how this may or may not interface with the reverse amenity policy changes that we took with respect to nuisance?
Help me understand what you mean by that.
So probably last year we considered a report through the planning committee that looked at the issue of managing nuisance and established a principle of reverse amenity. In other words, somebody that moved into an area and carried out a new land use shouldn't be in a position where they can complain about an existing user that has been carrying out a use for a long time. So,
yes.
You know, you might have old mate there with the cow and somebody moves in after the fact, but that adjacent block of land has been used as a hobby farm and has had cows on it for some time. The cow owner shouldn't have their rights prejudiced merely because somebody has moved in and caused complaint. So we considered that through the planning committee. I think it was last year, and I think the intention is to incorporate that into a planning scheme amendment, but I could have that process wrong in my head. Just because it deals with the planning scheme and nuisance, I thought it might be useful to get some advice on that point too.
No objection to that, yes.
Yeah. Councillor Gates.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have some concern about the, I think what's being proposed is to remove the effective control requirement for dogs off leash and to reword it to say as long as the dog is visible. But then it went on to suggest that the dog needed to be able to respond to a voice control, but your dog can be visible and not hear you. So I have a bit of a problem with that.
So it needs to do both, Councillor Gates.
It does need to do both, and in my view, the dog must be under effective control.
It proposes to do both.
Okay. In relation to the keeping of hens, I have a huge concern about that because I'm aware of a property that's a waterfront property that keeps hens at the back and opens the gate of the enclosure, and the hens cluck their way along the sand every morning and every afternoon, and it's highly irritating to the people who live there. So in the proposed law, I would be more comfortable with a permit being required for any land under possibly 2,000 square metres, and that there be a requirement also for the hens to be constrained by an enclosure that matches the 150 square metres per bird, because the way it's suggested at the moment, the hens could just cluck around the backyard, couldn't they? And as long as they're not within a certain distance of a residence. Now, you can get a house on 1,300 square metres where the 10 metres is clearly possible between the residences with hens clucking around the backyard. It's very annoying in an urban community. So were your considerations based around possibly the administrative cost of issuing permits rather than the amenity benefits to the community if a permit were necessary?
Thank you. Through the chair. Councillor Gates, the issues around the permit being removed was not around the governance and administrative costs associated with that. They are very, very few permits that have been issued for anything other than excess dogs or other excess animals. In relation to hens, I have not seen one across my table in 4 years for a hen application. The minimum standards, while the permit itself was suggested to be removed, the requirements to hold those hens is still in place. So, and those include they must be contained within an enclosure within the property boundary itself, and it must be at least 1 metre from every boundary fence and the 10 metres from any other dwelling. It does not suggest any free range ability within it. So therefore, the situation you currently identified where the hens are just let out, if we are happy to address that
Okay, but it doesn't help with my concern that an enclosure may also be 10 metres away from a dwelling, and that it's damned annoying in an urban community to hear hens clucking incessantly. And, you know, I just I have a problem with that on a small allotment under 2,000 square metres.
Yeah, so two issues there, I suppose, Councillor Gates. You've got a view that hens should be out of a suburban setting. Yep, number one. Number two, on the issue of assessment and permits, the analogy in my head is that it's a proposal to move hens from code-assessable to self-assessable. It is probably, I think, what officers are seeking to achieve. So it's not so much that the requirements are being relaxed, although they are in this one sense. It's more that the DA needn't be lodged and they can get a private certifier
Can we open?
in to sign off on the hens. But take your point about the noise. For me, it's feces.
Well, and on a waterfront too, it's where there's hens.
And you'd worry about the enriched nutrients entering the waterways, causing the potential for algal blooms.
The party house map. The hen house map.
The hen house or the hen party map. Hens party map. Councillor Castro, then Councillor Patterson.
Why did they choose 4,000 square metres?
Oh, sorry. Councillor Young, Councillor Castro, Councillor Patterson. My apologies.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mine is, again, with the noise nuisance, but with the dogs. Now, in a lot of our built-up areas, obviously the dogs, quite often the dogs are in the backyard and we're behind 6-foot concrete fences with gates and that on it. So people either side are making complaints about noises, but our officers are coming to the front and sitting out the front and saying, well, no, we don't hear continuous noise because we've got a 6-foot high fence, no access to the property, and the dogs are in the backyard. Now, I've had this complaint time and time again where the officers come and they acknowledge that the officers have been there. The residents who make the complaint acknowledge that the officers have been there. But if the officers are on this side of the road with traffic noise and that, and our residents who are making the complaints are backing onto those properties, which quite often don't have solid fences all the way around, they have the solid fence at the front, what sort of reassurance, I guess, to our residents can we put into place that, you know, they're experiencing the noise in the rear of their property, but our officers are actually sometimes quite a few metres away or hundreds of metres away at times from where the noise actually is, and they'll say, well, there was no noise evidence while we were there. How can we address that issue?
Yeah, through the chair, yes, Councillor Young. The officers, when they do our investigations in relation to that, will often initially assess from the front of a property just to get an idea of whether the time of the diary is appropriate. If there is any level of noise or anything, they do have an opportunity. They will either utilise rear neighbours rather than the complainant, not to alert the complainant nor the owner of the dog. That way we're utilising a third-party area if it is in the rear of a property. Or we do have the opportunity to meet with the complainant where they're actually being impacted. So it may require us at 2 a.m. in the morning to sit in a bedroom of a complainant and record that noise for a period of time if it really came down to it. But we try to avoid that impacting on the complainant as much as possible.
Wow. Whoa.
Yeah, right. And an additional question, if that's all right, Chair. The other one is with I know our local law officers, when they go out, they're wearing cameras and we're able to... do our animal management officers have the same benefit of having recordings there? But quite often we hear from officers or animal owners that, you know, we didn't, and I've heard it umpteen times, we didn't give the correct information, we gave them a gobful and off we went, etc., etc. So they are in the same, I guess, safety, secure position to be recording at all times?
That is correct, yes. Yep. Every public interaction is recorded through body-worn cameras on all our animal management staff.
And has that improved the safety of the officers? Because I know they have to go out with police officers on the weekend, or they have in the past gone out with police officers on the weekend?
Yes, that has. On the introduction of those cameras approximately 5 years ago, there has been a reduction in that. We do find, I guess, that the where there is always a minority where they are still occurring, and that level of aggression is greater in more recent times, but there have been less incidents of aggression from the public.
And with the hours of the officers being out and about, obviously in beach areas, as I'm sure the director and I've seen the director out in the morning when we're out very, very early, and there is dogs off leashes everywhere. Yep. So are the officers able to do those hours as well at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, where I've been bowled over on the beach on numerous occasions? Yes, Council, there are opportunities. There are some restraints around our operational hours. However, where we do receive complaints and it is for a very particular time, 4:30 in the morning, or it's a bit harder in winter, it's dark still, we do have the opportunity for overtime in other areas to be able to accommodate those patrols. Beautiful. Yep. Thank you. That's answered my questions.
Yeah, I mean, patrols, I think Councillor Belden Lumsden and I on a unity ticket on this. It's so important that we do get patrols when behaviour is at its worst. I mean, during this meeting I was contacted by residents just beside themselves, again at Robina Common and again at Lake Orr, because of a minority of animal owners doing the wrong thing. And I just want to say this as well. It must be so frustrating working in this space, knowing that there are so many Gold Coasters who are failing to register their animals. It must make the work of identifying troublesome animals all that harder, prosecuting those who have been involved in an attack so much harder, and it must be much harder than to provide facilities and services to accommodate dogs comfortably in off-leash areas, for example, if we don't know where the animals actually reside. I think when I spoke with city officers about this initially, I flagged with them that it's great amending the local law, but it must have been years since we've had resources through corporate communication to actually reach the community and encourage them to take the simple step of registering their animals and communicating to them what the consequences can be. It's a huge blind spot, I feel, for us. And if we are to proceed with these amendments in some form, I think we need a big public campaign in the space. Really, we need to start hammering home some home truths, if only to support the work of our officers on the ground. Councillor Castro, Patterson, then Belden Lumsden.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Look, I have the similar concerns to Councillor Gates with the hens, but that one's been covered because mine are exactly the same. I'm not sure about the 2,000. That's about the only thing we might differ on, but
you're on 4,000.
Yeah, but certainly on residential properties, I think there's a whole host of issues that come with hens, which is a concern. But the other two issues, one again, actually I'll go to one that Councillor Gates has already raised. It's the off-leash dog area. That concerns me greatly because feasibly, and I can't think of any off-leash dog areas in the city, not that I get out much, but feasibly someone could literally be sitting in a coffee shop across the road while the dog's there because they can say, well, I can still see it, or they could be involved in another activity in a big open space, doing their own thing, playing with the kids, whatever, paying no attention whatsoever to the dog. That really concerns me a lot.
Sorry, Councillor Lacastro, I just want to make this clear on behalf of city officers. The approach that they've taken in the test of effective control, if we could just go back to that slide, is actually much more focused and harsher than the supervision test of other local governments.
Sure.
So usually it's under supervision, but the intent from a city officer point of view was to really strengthen it. If that dog's out of your line of sight, or if you are distracted by doing something else, then you're breached. So I'm not sure if, it sounds as though you were across that.
Yes,
but I just want to clear that up.
Absolutely, but it then comes down to the interpretation of when the dog is in your line of sight or your vision and the distances. that's what concerns me, because the dog can be in your line of sight, but you can be 100 metres away, kicking a ball around or whatever, and you're not paying any attention to the dog at all. At least with the 10 metres, even though that might have been a bit too restrictive as such, that's the only that's a concern for me. But
can I ask, just because I really value your opinion as the former chair of the committee and long-serving councillor, that off-leash bit, do you think, say you've got a fenced off-leash area, right? I regard that as being different to an unfenced off-leash area. So do you think there's something to be said about applying a distance test in an unfenced area, but in an enclosure, allowing that dog to have free rein inside the fenced area despite where you might be located?
Look, there's definitely a difference between a fenced area and an unfenced area, but we're still talking about distance. If you've got a big fenced area, you can still be a considerable way away from, you know what I'm saying, from your animal. So it still concerns me. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah.
Chairman, if I might just add to that.
Yeah, please.
I think that we must have the dog being under the effective control of the owner, no matter whether it's fenced or unfenced. You see dogs that are not effectively controlled within leash-free areas,
yes,
and in off-leash areas that are unfenced. So fenced or not,
yes,
we must firm up, I believe, on effective control. And I don't think being visible, as is suggested in the proposed law here, and able to respond to controlled voice command, says it as thoroughly as it used to when it said the dog must be under the effective control of the owner. I think that's all it needs to say in the proposed law, because that covers off on it all. And for us as representatives in responding to complaint from the community and when people take their leash, unleash their dog, it's very simple to get the message across that your dog must be under your effective control, leashed or unleashed.
And I think, just had a bit of confusion here, my sense of it is that dogs must be visible to person in control, and dogs must also be able to be controlled by voice commands and must not threaten, attack other animals or people, is the definition of effective control. So it's not that effective control is excluded as a test, that's our definition of effective control, which someone is obliged to exercise over the animal. It's the definition of the thing that we're trying to achieve.
I just want to make the point that dogs must be able to be controlled by voice commands.
Yes.
Most dogs are able to be controlled by voice commands, but in the specific circumstance of you unleashing your dog, I just think we need to make it far more simple, is my personal view, than all those words describing effective control. Effective control sums it up, and I want that to be in the law personally.
Yeah, and I agree with you. My sense of it, and I'll come to city officers in a moment, my sense of it is that a broad definition has not withstood scrutiny.
Okay, so if we could have a dash and then those words, I'm happy, but effective control of the owner and a dash must be able to respond to controlled voice commands and so on. I'm sorry to take over there, Councillor Cassidy.
No, this is good. I mean, like you guys across this. Is that a sensible bit of feedback that can be incorporated?
Could I just clarify?
Please.
That's probably my error in the way I phrased that, in paraphrasing that in that slide. The change being made is that this dog will still be required to be under effective control. It's the definition of effective control which is being altered in so much as that the dog must now be visible to the person instead of the requirement for it to be within the 10 metres. So the other requirements of effective control are proposed to remain the same insofar as those, it being able to be controlled by voice commands and being not threatening or attacking other animals. So that will remain the same.
You're just broadening the description.
So currently, your dog could be behind you having a squabble with another dog, and it may meet the definition currently of effective control because it's within 10 metres. The new approach is to say you actually need to be looking at your dog and being able to exercise in that moment control over the animal. Councillor Castra's point then is, well, ultimately how far can that distance be? And do you practically lose the effect of effective control if a dog's at the other end of a dog park, correct?
And you can still yell at it,
Yeah.
My dog's deaf. It just makes it impossible to take the leash off.
Sorry, Councillor Castra, we've had so many segues, I apologise.
Okay. And the final one, which concerns me, or maybe there's no need for concern because we had sort of scant information on this one. I know we're going to have more information coming back when it's presented to us, so this is just an overview. So forgive me, I'm not sort of trying to attack like a dog or anything like that, but the breeding one, the breeding permits, to whom are the breeding permits going to be relaxed? So for what type of animal breeding?
So worried about puppy farms?
I'm more concerned about, well, dogs, yes, but I'm particularly concerned about cats, cat breeders, because over my years in the chair, there were a number of issues, and one in particular in my very early days of council where somebody was literally breeding cats on a residential property, and we're talking about a lot of cats on that property, and the stench for the neighbours, let alone the noise, it was just unbearable, and so it really concerns me if we're going to be relaxing. To say, yeah, you can breed your cats at home and you can, blah, 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 and your dogs, but that is a concern.
Yeah.
And through the chair, Councillor, yes, the Animal Management Cats and Dogs Act took on the requirement for breeder legislation a couple of years ago. Gold Coast Council were fortunate to run a pilot program on the breeder permits as why it was put into the local law. Now it's a duplication of the same requirements under the state legislation. So this is an opportunity to remove it because it doesn't really add any value to what's already in place, particularly in relation to dogs. Great. In regards to cats, we already have sufficient law in place to limit numbers of cats to be kept on properties. We only allow a maximum of 4, I believe, on any given property without a permit. And therefore, if there was ever any concerns around the breeding or the numbers or so forth, we would manage the numbers based on the current local law requirements. However, anything in relation to welfare of the animals themselves, like the puppy farm, cat farming, that would be undertaken by Biosecurity Queensland and RSPCA, which is where the state law came in.
Great, another good state issue. Yes. Love it. Councillor Patterson and then Councillor Tozer.
Thank you, Chair. Through you.
Oh, sorry, yep.
First of all, on the control of animals table again. So if we could just go back to that. I just want to make a couple of comments about what's been said.
Yeah.
So I visit a lot of dog parks and frequent visitor to the Botanical Gardens Dog Park, Sun Valley, Musgrave and the Spit. So 2 things. The first one with your point about the on-leash and that those perhaps attaching those effective control points to the on-leash. I disagree with that. I have met numerous dogs who really, first of all, as puppies, can't be controlled but need to be socialised and they're on a leash. Or dogs that really are quite dangerous but are on leash and again are getting socialised. There's one dog that comes down to Sun Valley and he wears a little cape that says, stay clear, I'm not a safe dog. But it would be I think it would be doing a disservice if we didn't actually allow someone to take a dog out like that on the leash. So I think just having the leash, if you've got that, is sufficient. My experience is that owners who have dogs who may be dangerous or a bit of a concern on leashes are very, very aware of it and sensitive to it. So that's why I would support the officer's existing definition there and not make that alteration. The second thing about the off-leash, I just wanted to give Councillor Castro, with his concern about the not being on a distance, it is important, I think, that we can give those dogs the distance. So you hit a tennis ball for a dog to get, you become more than 10 metres very quickly. It's a pretty important part of a dog's life that they can go and do that. So again, I think that this really makes sense. You're visible, that they will respond, but it's not written to that specific criteria. I did have just two other points. One question was, it's great to see the work done on protecting our koalas. I'm wondering if there's anything with regard to other smaller, maybe not quite so cute wildlife in with regards to cats, who probably do far more prolific damage to our wildlife in our city. Is there any consideration of that?
Through the chair, councillor, the requirements, I assume in relation to cats being able to wander, more than anything, yeah, our current local law actually requires cats to be contained to an enclosure at all times. It might have been an interest in news recently that Victoria, Knox City Council are just introducing a cat curfew. We already have that in play. Yes. Our local law actually requires a cat owner to make sure their cat is contained to an enclosure at all times. If they want to take it out, they have to put it on a lead, which we actually have 1 or 2 cat owners currently do.
And
thank you.
And on the cat thing, I actually bought a cat trap on eBay. They're only about $35, and I keep them at my office. And yeah, I'll send it your way through internal mail. And I bring them along to neighbourhood watch meetings because, you know, neighbourhood watch residents tend to be vigilant in the space, and they will catch a cat, and you know, it's up to them to make sure that's done humanely, and then they contact our animal management team, who then deal with the cat and reunite it with its owner. But $35 on eBay, a quick fix. I keep one at my office. I'll send you the link, or maybe you can have a lend of it after Councillor Gates.
Very good. Thank you for getting me up to speed on that one. And then just lastly, regarding the noise matter and the duration and interference requirements now, which certainly make a lot of sense, and the complaints that I've dealt with go to, I think this addresses a lot of the complaints that I receive in terms of that current law and it being very prescriptive. I was just curious about that first part A, the interference, a person's reasonable use. So we don't have any noise, you don't have any decibel measures effectively on that. So that does really provide you a lot of flexibility on that now, right? Because my understanding is that if you hear a noise once, it may be it's at a certain decibel, then it might not affect you too much. Might be a low decibel, but if you've got that consistently going, then your mind's there picking that sound up all the time. So will we now be able to kind of take action in those kind of situations?
Through the chair, yes, that is correct, councillor. It does allow us to consider how a person living in that property for many years has had to endure that noise, and whilst it might not impact on us specifically, it's what the person themselves is doing and the potential for it to be an ongoing issue. Yes.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just had 2 questions. First one, when you brought up the dog registration, I actually had a question about what enforcement actions we have available to us for people experiencing homelessness that have pets that obviously don't have a place of residence to register their pet to.
Look, that's a difficult one. I'm happy for officers to respond to that in open. I just wonder whether it's more sensitively taken offline. Okay. Obviously casting no judgments on the age of people who may be struggling with homelessness, who may also have an animal. I do know that pet registration is made freely available to people over a particular age. I suppose, Director, would you prefer to take that one offline, or Councillor Belden-Lumsden, would you like an answer now?
If it wants to be taken offline, in regards to your comment, Chair, I know obviously homelessness can affect people of all ages.
Yes.
it's not so much the registration side of things. I'm happy to be compassionate and understand that not everyone has those options. It's more just when the animals cause a nuisance to the broader community. That was more my concern.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, good.
So,
yeah, good catch.
So through the chair, I know that definitely some people who are experiencing homelessness have animals that are registered. So, but I'm happy to take on notice and give you further advice, councillor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my second question, less sensitive. There was consultation for the dog off leash areas around the city. When's that due to come back through?
Through the chair, that's presently sitting at the reviewing of the 336 submissions in relation to those and most submissions were more than an A4 page full of information. So I'm presently reviewing all of those. I'm hoping to have them completed within the next 4 weeks, at which time then it'll come back up. There will be a need to speak to a number of councillors whose areas where those submissions are, either for or against, to get a bit more detail on.
So will there be some councillor briefings before the report to committee?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Councillor Tozer?
Thank you. There was a page before that talked about geese, ducks and turkeys on acreage lots. And removal of prohibitions on acreage, that's it there. When we do, I'm conscious of making sure that geese and ducks and turkeys are probably no problem on most acreage, particularly large rural lots, you know. But when our animal management team respond to a query about, or respond to a complaint about noise, and it becomes evident that that property owner is breeding those for sale, do we refer that to the development compliance team? Because it occurs to me there's a transition between having pets and being on a rural property, but if it's only 4,000 square metres, some of those properties are quite close, and I can understand if there's lots of geese or ducks or turkeys being bred there for sale, that would be a different proposition. So can you tell me what happens when that's observed? Through the chair.
Yeah, through the chair. Councillor, if that occurs and it's identified through means that it is deemed to be for a commercial activity, it would then go to development compliance to determine whether that's intensification of the use or require MCU of any type. It wouldn't therefore come through animal management with the local laws. We would then refer it over to development compliance to review on the breeding side as a commercial activity.
What are through the chair again, what are the current numbers for geese, ducks and turkeys on an acreage property?
I would have to...
Like, is it a lot or is it a little, or do you know? Or
is it 40 at this point? I'm being...
So right now there's a limit of 40 ducks on an acreage property?
Correct.
And is it 1 acre?
There's a prohibition on any more than 40 geese, ducks or turkeys on any land greater than an acre, I believe.
Is it 40 per acre? Are we taking it on notice?
Let's take that on
notice. Yeah, take it on notice. And again, I think what I'm trying to get at is that on a normal rural property that's outside the rural residential zone, I don't think there should be any prohibition on bird life or bird pets or whatever. If you're in a rural zone, there shouldn't really be provisions. We shouldn't be engaging in that. In a rural residential zone, I'm conscious that some people are effectively conducting commercial activity, and I would hate to think that just because it's not an animal management issue, we don't just leave it. We should actually investigate it as an unlawful commercial activity in a residential area. And when that occurs, I don't know what other councillors feel like, but I'd probably like to know that that's occurring. Is there any mechanism by which the animal management team could just have some sort of note to make the councillor aware once a month of the development compliance issues that have been referred from animal management? Is that doable or not? It just helps us manage complaints, that's all.
Through the chair, I can't see why we wouldn't be able to provide from our activities, if there, as it relates to councillor divisions, feedback as to how many we may have referred on.
Yeah,
sure.
I think that would be helpful to me. I'm not sure other councillors, but yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. For today, I realise that there is no substantive decision concerning this presentation today. That will be dealt with in the Governance, Administration and Finance Committee. But before I close the meeting, I might just invite Councillor Gates just to understand, where did you land on the GBI? Were you happy to? Oh, great. Absolutely.
Local law amendments 2021, or the animal management local law amendment 2020.
We could just hand it over, but
Is
it's written in shorthand.
Is
the best.
Is presented to Governance, Administration and Finance. That consideration be given to increasing to 4 penalty units the fine for wandering at large breaches.
Wandering in large breaches?
Wandering at large was the description within the report. Is that the correct terminology for that particular breach? Okay, so when the annual local amendment is presented to Governance, Administration, Finance, that consideration be given to increasing to 4 FOUR penalty units the fine for wandering at large breaches.
Sorry,
the fine.
And Councillor Gates, just interested in your thoughts about the fine for dogs that are not under effective control, i.e. dogs that have attacked another.
Well, the description was wandering at large, and then I think there was a corresponding, sorry, let me find it. Wandering at large. Oh, it just said wandering at large. And by that, I presumed that that meant that the gate was left open or the dog wasn't under effective control, and that we just increase it to that penalty. And regardless of whether they attack or not, I think that we should make people aware that we're serious about them keeping their dog either housed or under their effective control.
So I'm 100% with you. I just don't know whether this motion as it reads deals with animals that are out and about, an off-leash dog area, for example, and who are not under effective control.
I'm happy for you to massage it any way you want.
So are you trying to...
Through you, Chair, we just were wanting to point out there's two different offences at the moment, wandering at large and not under effective control.
Right.
And so it would be helpful to actually itemise them individually or to note them as being intended to be the same if that's what your the goal is.
So perhaps the wandering is 4 and the non-effective control is 3. Or could it both be 4?
Both could be 4.
Yeah.
I think we're serious about making sure that people are safe in our community and people's pets are safe in our community.
Yeah. And that we provide the strongest possible deterrent to avoid avoidable and unnecessary loss of life.
Correct. Thank you for your help.
Councillor Caldwell.
Are those maximum penalties or are they prescribed amounts? So is there any discretion for officers to issue a fine that's for a lesser amount, depending on the severity?
No, they're prescribed,
right. So it's
although the officers can issue a warning.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So let's strengthen that then. Rather than asking city officers to consider it and thereby rule it out potentially, Councillor Gates, should we say that when the Animal Management Local Law Amendments 2021, which I take to mean the report, is presented to the Governance, Administration and Finance Committee, instead of saying that consideration, sorry, Councillor Tozer, what did you suggest?
You want a more definitive, that wandering at large breaches and not under effective control breaches be increased to 4 penalty units.
Yep.
And that will be quite that wording will be quite direct, but I'm not sure whether it...
Sorry, I had it the other way, given that not every member of the council is here and that it would be a decision of the full council. So I was purely being polite in suggesting that consideration be given and that the council would then determine the way forward.
Yeah, and I suppose at full council, so next Tuesday, anyone who wanted to walk that back would have an opportunity of suggesting 3 and 4 or to revert it to 2 and 2. Yeah. I couldn't look someone in the eyes who had been a victim of an attack if we didn't take this step. So I'm personally quite convicted around 4 and 4. Councillor Owen-Jones.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I think it's clearly heading in the right direction. I'd be interested in some information from officers in regards to the numbers of penalty and infringement notices in those two areas that we've issued, just so that we're aware of how many there may be, and in particular, what would the officer's preferred charge to be if there was an attack from a dog that was not in control and wandering the streets, for example. So which is the actual category that I think that we're most keen to make sure that there is a penalty. Does that make sense? No. So I'm interested in knowing the numbers. So like the volume of numbers for those two different categories.
Yep.
And what would the category that you would most like to issue a notice for if there was an attack by an animal that wasn't under control because it was just wandering the streets?
Yep. So which of the two is the most powerful deterrent based on past experience?
So my understanding is the city, for example, has very few declared dangerous dogs. There's not a vast number of them, but it's those animals in particular that I'm also interested in making sure that are appropriately controlled and aren't out and all of those type of things. But I think if we had a little bit more information in regards to the numbers, that might help guide us in regards to the penalty.
Can I just, and I hate pointing to specific cases, but that recent death, my reading of the media reports is that that animal was subject to a council, and not our council, but a council's investigation between, so there was an alleged incident, the animal was under investigation, and before that investigation was brought to a conclusion, unfortunately, this child has passed. Again, that's just based on the media reports, and I'm not here to prejudice anybody's right to natural justice and due process. But could I just put it to city officers in the setting that I would hope that we have processes as a city to deal firmly in cases of suspected menacing or attack, so that we can avoid similar situations unfolding in our own city. Something you need to respond to, but it's just something that's weighing on me given the scale of the tragedy. Yep. Councillors, any further questions? We've got Councillor Gates moving, and I'm happy to second that motion. Well, it's really up to Councillor Gates. I'm happy to remove it because it gives the firmest direction to city officers, but it's Councillor Gates's motion, so.
Well, Chairman, remove it. It's fine.
Yeah, all right, so let's remove it.
And if anyone objects to it, then we'll worry about it when the time comes.
Yeah, great.
Excuse me, Councillor, through the Chair, I just realised the word breaches up there, please. Could you amend to offences? Sorry.
Would you mind if we just so it's very clear, wandering at large and not under effective control, I think, could they be in like inverted commas, just so we know that they're two separate breaches?
Yep.
Or two separate offences. I'm using the wrong language, sorry.
Sorry, that's my fault.
Classic. How's that?
Does that look?
Yeah.
I think it's
that's
a good
what
workshop.
They're named? Yeah.
Great.
I think I've presented a good motion.
Okay. Would you like to open, Councillor Gates?
Well, I think it's been a really productive conversation today, and I really believe that we want our community to enjoy their pet ownership, but responsibly so. And we also want to make sure that the community is aware that we want people to be safe on the streets. We want people to be safe at off-leash areas and on leash as well. So when they've got their pets on leash as well. I think we need to be serious about it in terms of the penalty units that we can apply for offences that occur. And they do occur in our city, and it's unfortunate, but I'm really pleased too that we've teased out the way that animal management can help in terms of declared dogs and dogs where an incident may happen. I hope that we as a council have given you enough scope to make sure that your efforts can be serious in seizing a dog where necessary to prevent any occurrence such as we've seen elsewhere this week. So I think this will be a good outcome.
Speakers against? Councillor Bailden-Lumsden, Councillor Owen-Jones.
So I don't want to speak really against it, other than the fact that I am interested in that information, because it may very well be that it makes some sense to not have the 4 penalty units for the 2 offences. It might actually make more sense to have a higher penalty for a particular incident. But if we can get that before council, I'd appreciate that. And likewise, just that information in regards, it might be, for example, that there is a category that the officers would prefer to use if, for example, it was a dangerous dog that breached and did something, as opposed to it just being 4 for 2 separate areas, if that makes sense.
And on that, just some clarity around, say it is a declared menacing or a declared dangerous dog that's involved in a breach, whether we do have recourse under the legislation to issue a fine, or we may be compelled to then pursue a destruction order. Like that's interesting to me as well, because my understanding is that we've been limited in the ability to fine those particular dogs.
Yeah, through the chair, just for clarity on that one, if a declared animal is in breach of any of the conditions, it falls under the Animal Management Act, not our local law. In relation to that, they would receive a fine under that for the breach of conditions, and additionally the fine for under the local law of wandering at large or not effective control. There is those avenues, and the seizure powers fall within the Act as well, which are very solid for us.
Okay, great. Well, would anyone like to speak against? We've had 1 for, 1 great other contribution. Councillor Gates, would you like to close?
Only in saying I appreciate Councillor Owen-Jones' point of view with this, and there will be certainly an opportunity for input following the receipt of further advice from the officers before full council, and I'm more than open to an amendment at full council if the officers believe we can get better impacts by changing those penalties.
Awesome. I'll put that to a vote. I should disclose that I have a dog, but she's 14.
Me too. Mine's deaf, so it's not under effective control at any time.
Councillors, yeah, I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? That's carried unanimously. Any further general business items? No. Declare the meeting closed at 3:07. Thank you.